tem como objetivo principal promover o debate sobre a pauta migratória, assim como difundir conhecimento acerca dos direitos dos migrantes e trazer reflexões concernente à proteção e inserção desses migrantes na sociedade e quais as implicações do aumento dos deslocamentos e a necessidade de garantia daqueles que migram. Para compor a nossa mesa de abertura, eu convido o magnífico reitor da Universidade Federal de Uberlândia, o professor Dr. Walter Steffen Jr., convido também o pró-reitor de pesquisa e pós-graduação da UF, o professor Dr. Carlos Henrique de Carvalho, a professora doutora Luciana Zacarias, diretora da Faculdade de Direito, e também a coordenadora do 8º Simpósio de Migração e Proteção de Pessoas, a professora Tatiana Skeff, e o coordenador do 8º Simpósio de Migração e Proteção de Pessoas, professor Tiago Paulo. Agradecemos mais uma vez a presença de todos e todas e passo a palavra para o professor Tiago.
Bem, boa noite a todos e a todas. Agradeço a presença de vocês nessa noite. Cumprimento os ilustres membros da mesa, na pessoa do nosso reitor, o professor Walter Steffen. Cumprimento também o nosso pró-reitor de pesquisa e pós-graduação, o professor Carlos Henrique de Carvalho, nossa diretora, a professora Luciana, minha querida colega e amiga, a professora Tatiana, que tem, nos últimos anos, aceitado essa empreitada de organizar esse evento anual, que celebra hoje a sua 8ª edição. Um evento que não parou nem durante a pandemia. A gente realizou de forma online durante a pandemia. E que nessa edição tem ainda o apoio, não só da nossa universidade, que tem dado um apoio à Faculdade de Direito, à Universidade Federal de Uberlândia, que tem dado um apoio imenso à realização do evento, mas também da FAPEMIG, que é a Fundação de Apoio à Pesquisa do Estado de Minas Gerais, que nessa edição está financiando a vinda dos nossos convidados, das nossas convidadas, através do edital de apoio a eventos científicos. Então também fazer esse agradecimento especial à FAPEMIG, porque sem ela nós não conseguiríamos trazer tantos colegas e pessoas que estão aqui para poder participar dos painéis que ocorreram hoje e amanhã. Cumprimentar também os nossos convidados, as nossas convidadas aqui presentes, que vieram do sul dos Estados Unidos, da UNB, do Paraná, de BH. Então, cumprimentar e agradecer a presença de todos vocês e desejar um excelente evento a todos e a todas. Obrigado.
Obrigada, professor Tiago. Passo a palavra agora para a professora Tatiana.
Muito obrigada, Vitória, pela condução dos trabalhos. Boa noite a todos e todas. Saúdo aqui aos meus colegas de mesa na pessoa do professor Walter. Um prazer imenso tê-los aqui conosco nessa mesa de abertura. Assim como saúdo a todos que estão aqui presentes, nossos convidados de hoje, de amanhã, assim como os nossos estudantes, pois sem vocês e o interesse de vocês também não teríamos esse evento e não teríamos essa 8ª edição do nosso Simpósio de Migrações e Proteção de Pessoas. É um prazer imenso recebê-los aqui. Eu não vou me alongar, apenas gostaria de repisar as palavras do professor Tiago, que é uma alegria imensa ver esse auditório cheio na noite de hoje para prestigiar aqui os nossos palestrantes. Nesse sentido, agradeço imensamente a presença e já devolvo a palavra. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada, professora Tatiana. Passo a palavra agora para a professora Luciana, diretora da FADIC.
Olá a todos e todas, muito boa noite. Cumprimento os membros da mesa, cumprimento a todos os presentes nesse auditório. Que bonito ver o auditório cheio, A gente estava até aqui na sexta-feira, pela manhã, comentando sobre isso. como a gente estava carente desses eventos onde a gente pudesse se encontrar face a face, trocar informações, trocar experiências, trocar ideias. Então, eu tenho muito a cumprimentar e agradecer ao professor Tatiana, ao professor Tiago, pelo esforço que eles fazem em promover todos esses eventos, né, que trazem esse ar da internacionalização, a preocupação com aquilo que está acontecendo, não só no Brasil, mas também no mundo. A questão da migração é uma questão bastante séria, a gente tem observado um aumento dos fluxos migratórios, pelos mais diferentes motivos, né, mas aqui hoje discutindo a violação dos direitos humanos. É uma preocupação que eles estão sempre estudando, e buscando, e lutando, e defendendo as pessoas que estão fugindo da miséria, da intolerância religiosa, que estão fugindo, né, de condições de trabalho de grande sofrimento, enfim. São várias situações que provocam esses fluxos migratórios que o pessoal estuda aqui. Os nossos alunos têm contribuído bastante, né, professor Cristiano, o pessoal das Relações Internacionais também, uma parceria muito grande com o curso de lá. Então, só tenho a agradecer a presença de todos e todas aqui, agradecer demais o prestígio da Reitoria, Administração Superior, que sempre está presente nos eventos da Faculdade de Direito, o professor Valdo, o professor Carlos Henrique, estão sempre acompanhando a nossa movimentação. Então, eu tenho muito a agradecer mesmo por esse prestígio, aos nossos colegas professores pela realização do evento, e que venham mais eventos, mais palestras, mais seminários, mais discussões, mais encontros, mais networking, né, gente? Vamos aproveitar esse momento para isso também. E é isso. Bem-vindos. Vamos ter um ótimo evento.
Obrigada, professora Luciana. Passo a palavra agora ao pró-reitor de Pesquisa e Pós-Graduação, professor Carlos Henrique de Carvalho.
Boa noite a todos e a todas. É uma satisfação. Cumprimento o professor Valdo, meu amigo, professora Luciana, professora Tatiane, professor Tiago, que trabalha junto comigo na ProTP, diretor de inovação, né? É sempre uma satisfação estar com vocês num evento que vai tratar de um tema tão relevante, atual. Ele é o antigo e moderno, né? Ele tem um aspecto da história e tem um aspecto da atualidade. Vou tentar falar rapidamente, já em 3 minutos, o que eu penso sobre isso, das minhas experiências, né? E a professora Luciana, eu já tinha chamado a atenção, fazia muito tempo que eu não via esse anfiteatro com esse número de pessoas. Eu já participei de várias aberturas. Eu estava comentando em off com a professora Tatiana.
Eu vou tirar até foto com esse pessoal.
Que eu cheguei a contar em uma abertura de um evento quantas pessoas tinham 23. Lógico que nós estamos saindo de uma crise sanitária que gera isso, gera um temor, gera um receio, né? E as pessoas agora estão se sentindo mais seguras em estar, né, se aproximando novamente. Eu acho que isso é fundamental. Essa troca humana é fundamental, né? Porque o online é só a gente dar lá o off, e aí o off, tem que encerrar a reunião, né? Se a palestra está chata, dá o off lá, ou a gente faz a rede cair, né? Mas, né, não é o caso do presencial. E falar do tema da migração, né, dos direitos das pessoas, eu acho fundamental. Em 2015, eu estive na Turquia, na região dos curdos, né? Aí eu, conversando com um grupo de amigos, eu falei, deu alguma coisa errada no ser humano, que foi uma situação muito complicada, né? E de 2015 para cá, já se vão 8 anos que a situação não melhorou. Aliás, piorou, né? E nós estamos enfrentando uma série de movimentos populacionais, que são os movimentos migratórios, espontâneos e não espontâneos, mas que se migram é porque há um problema de território. E se há um problema de território, né, eles procuram outros territórios. Os territórios em movimento, que eu vou criando comunidades. E nesse processo eu acho que as instituições elas têm que dar respostas. Porque são pessoas que precisam de apoio. Estava conversando com o Tiago, como que é complicado às vezes um processo, né, de uma guerra, quando surgiu na Ucrânia, as pessoas têm que sair e às vezes não conseguem levar tudo que precisam, coisas básicas como uma documentação. E aí nós temos que acolher essas pessoas, E acolher essas pessoas significa garantir continuar os estudos. Vou falar agora propriamente da Universidade Federal de Belém, que é a universidade regulamentar como vai acontecer esse acolhimento. Como vai acontecer esse acolhimento na graduação, e aí eu vou falar da pró-reitoria, que eu estou responsável por ela, que é a pró-reitoria de pesquisa e pós-graduação. É garantir o direito de ingresso, o direito de continuidade e depois o direito de emissão do documento que vá qualificá-lo, né, ou chancelá-lo para o mercado de trabalho nesses territórios em movimento. Então isso eu considero fundamental. E tem sido uma discussão mundial. Né? Estava em Washington essa semana e um dos painéis tinha muito a ver com isso. Como que as universidades vão criar espaços de recebimento. Né? Recebimento desses imigrantes, né, que espontaneamente ou forçadamente, né, perderam o seu espaço, saíram do seu espaço. Então eu acredito que um evento como esse, né, coloca, né, na mesa do debate as possibilidades daquilo que nós podemos aprimorar enquanto instituição, mas ao mesmo tempo fazer uma grande reflexão sobre a questão sul, que vocês estavam discutindo hoje, mas a questão norte-sul, a questão leste-oeste. Porque esses movimentos, eles não vão parar. Eu tenho desde conflitos até questões ambientais. As pessoas estão fugindo, estão buscando outros territórios exatamente pela degradação do meio ambiente, e aquele espaço ele não é mais habitável. Então são uma série de questões que eu acho que os professores e as professoras que vão debater isso, né, trarão, né, subsídios para que, através da Faculdade de Direito, através do grupo de pesquisa, coordenado pela professora Tatiana, pelo professor Tiago, possa contribuir de alguma maneira para que nós, enquanto gestão superior, podemos aprimorar as nossas resoluções, né, para o acolhimento desse povo. Tá? Então eu agradeço muito o convite, espero que vocês tenham, né, uma excelente noite de debate, né, e amanhã o seminário continuará com a professora, que eu já esqueci o nome, né, Josi, né, tão fácil, né, professora Josi do Rio Grande do Sul, né, que é um grande espaço migratório. Né? Migração alemã, migração italiana, forçada, não só espontânea. Tá? Então, um bom evento para todos e todas, né? E que as discussões sejam as mais proveitosas possíveis.
Obrigada pelas palavras, professor. E, por fim, passo então a palavra ao magnífico reitor, professor Dr. Walter Steffen Jr.
Obrigado. Boa noite. Para mim é um privilégio estar novamente aqui. Ainda na semana passada tivemos um outro evento também voltado para o direito internacional. E nesse sentido eu cumprimento a professora Luciana, a professora Tatiana, o professor Tiago, cumprimento o meu amigo professor Carlos Henrique, nosso pró-reitor, e cumprimento muito fortemente a toda a comissão que preparou, que organizou esse evento. Eu acho o tema muito interessante e particularmente por essa preocupação de, conforme está aqui no título do próprio simpósio, Migração no Sul Global. Não sei se vocês têm acompanhado, mas o governo brasileiro, particularmente a Diretoria de Cooperação Internacional da CAPES e também a ANGIFES, que é a nossa Associação Nacional dos Dirigentes das Instituições Federais de Ensino Superior, tem enfatizado a relação Sul-Sul. Como sabemos, naturalmente, a gente tem feito muito mais, especialmente nas universidades públicas, o intercâmbio Norte-Sul, Sul-Norte. E o Sul-Sul nem tanto. e, evidentemente, é algo que deveríamos fazer, até para podermos acolher um pouco melhor todos os nossos vizinhos, né, aqui da América do Sul, e também com esse enfoque na África também. E, portanto, eu acho que é um grande desafio. Não sei quanto que relacionamento universidade para universidade, nessa relação sul-sul, se encaixa na temática, mas eu quero imaginar que se encaixa muito bem. E, evidentemente, a dificuldade está, quando a gente fala de cooperação sul-sul, exatamente o problema do financiamento. Quando falamos de sul-norte, norte-sul, parece que encontramos mais facilmente os recursos para fazer isso. Ainda hoje à tarde, nessa tarde de hoje, eu recebi a diretora regional do Banco Santander. E ela estava me falando sobre projetos financiados pelo Banco Santander, mas sempre voltado, basicamente, Brasil, Europa, com foco na Espanha. Evidentemente, por conta da origem e dos interesses do banco mencionado. Mas eu estou apenas ilustrando para dizer que é fácil, ou não é tão difícil, a gente conseguir financiamento dentro desse... A própria tradição da Universidade Federal de Uberlândia, vocês sabem, nós temos muitos projetos com os Estados Unidos, mas a participação da Europa nos nossos projetos é muito forte, como convênios de cooperação, particularmente com a França, mas também com outros países, Portugal, Espanha, Inglaterra, Alemanha, Finlândia, né, um projeto, nós temos inclusive uma cooperação grande na própria ESEBA com a Finlândia. Mas no Sul-Sul, eu acho que nós temos ainda um dever de casa a ser cumprido. Né? Eu participei recentemente de um evento internacional chamado Grupo Tordesilhas de Universidades, e vários colegas de universidades sul-americanas, eles reclamam um pouco, né, exatamente dessa falta de intercâmbios, convênios de longo prazo com o Brasil. Eu sei que no caso da Universidade Federal, por exemplo, do Rio Grande do Sul, é uma particularidade. Eu sei que vocês têm muitos convênios com a Universidade do Uruguai e da Argentina em particular. Mas quando a gente olha o conjunto das universidades federais, isso não ocorre dessa maneira. Então é algo que precisamos construir, e dentro exatamente desse contexto das migrações no sul global. E uma região do globo muito mais pobre, com enormes desafios, e particularmente na África existem muitas guerras esquecidas, muitos conflitos étnicos, os mais variados, e essas pessoas precisam ser acolhidas, especialmente os estudantes que podem vir para as nossas universidades. I'd like to say a few words in English, considering that this is an international meeting. I'd like to suggest that our international visitors could take some time to visit our campus and also the city of Uberlândia. People who come from other places in Brazil and abroad and visit Uberlândia like it very much. And they always say that the Brazilian and the gastronomy from Uberlândia is very nice and the prices are very convenient. So I strongly suggest you to know a little bit of Uberlândia and our gastronomy. Parabéns pelo evento, sucesso, boas discussões. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada, professor. Então, agradecemos a honrosa presença que marcou essa mesa de abertura. Desfaço a mesa, então, para darmos início ao primeiro painel do simpósio.
Foi ótimo.
Pessoal, vamos dar início então ao primeiro painel. Mais uma vez agradeço a presença. Chamo primeiro para compor a mesa o mestrando da Universidade Federal de Uberlândia, Antônio, seja bem-vindo. Convido novamente a professora doutora Tatiana Skeff. Nossos palestrantes de hoje, convido o professor Dr. Igor Sabino, do IBMEC. And finally, I would like to invite Professor Christina Campbell from the University of the District of Columbia. Desejo a todos e a todas uma boa noite e daremos então início ao nosso primeiro painel.
Boa noite a todos. É com um imenso prazer que eu abro esse painel ao lado de ilustres pesquisadores e professores que abordam a temática do direito internacional e das migrações no cenário internacional. É um prazer para mim estar aqui. And Professor Campbell, it's a pleasure for us to receive you here in the Federal University of Uberlândia and in Uberlândia as a city. I'll give you the floor so you can start your exposition. And that's it. Thank you.
I apologize for not being able to speak in Portuguese. I learned Spanish instead. Okay, so my talk is about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the failure to protect children on the U.S.-Mexico border. I know that internationally what's been happening on the U.S.-Mexico border has been getting a lot of attention recently, but the truth is there's been a lot of bad things happening down there for a very long time. It's just getting more attention now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been happening recently in the U.S. And when I say recently, I mean really in the last 20 years with a focus on maybe the last 7-8 years. And again, when Trump was president, a lot of other bad things happened that had never happened before. And I think, I hope it's educational for those of you that don't follow what's happening in the United States in terms of migration, especially child migration. So this is from a book that I read. It's a small book. I recommend it if you speak English. This is a woman who she'd been doing interviews with child migrants, and this is what she said about the kids. The children who cross Mexico and arrive at the U.S. border are not immigrants, not illegals, not merely undocumented minors. Those children are refugees of a war, and as such they should have the right to asylum, but not all of them have it. And I think this year I'm visiting at the University of Utah. Utah is those of you that don't know where Utah is, it's in the far west part of the United States. It's above Arizona, which is a border state, right? That also gets a lot of attention. And so there's a lot of refugees that come up to Utah. And I was asked to help start a refugee law clinic there. And when people asked me what type of refugees I was going to help, they were like, oh, Ukraine, Afghanistan. I was like, Central America, South America. And they're like, what do you mean? Those people aren't refugees. I was like, they absolutely are refugees. And we should look at them as such, especially the kids. So I think in terms of like reframing the definition of refugee, especially in the United States, people go automatically to Ukraine, Afghanistan, and not that they are absolutely refugees, but I think who is a refugee is a really important question that we have to ask ourselves when we think about modern forced migration. Who is a refugee, right? Who qualifies for refugee status? So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's very ironic. The United States was a major drafter of this convention back in the 1990s. We signed the convention in 1995, and but to this day, we are the only UN member who has never ratified it. I think that says a lot about our values in the United States. There's a lot of lip service, I think, given to children and the rights of children and the lives of children. We love children, but we will not ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We continually and routinely violate international law by ignoring the rights of children. And we pledged to protect these rights of the children when we signed this convention 25 years ago. I like to remind people all the time, if we don't like the laws, we don't have to sign them, we don't have to create them, we don't have to be a part of them. We can just say, no, we don't want to be a part of them. But we're like, yes, we want to be a part of this. And then we're like, just kidding. We're not going to ratify it. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child states that childhood is entitled to special care and assistance. The family is the fundamental group of society, and the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all its members, and particularly children, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance so it can fully assume its responsibilities within the community. So this idea that childhood is a special time of life that's entitled to extra protection, I will say from having done a lot of asylum work for children, our internal asylum laws and policies and our domestic asylum laws in the United States do have special protections for children at the asylum officer level. There's two levels in the United States. You can either be in front of a judge or in front of an asylum officer, like an adjudicator. The adjudicators have special training where they go through special courses, special classes to know how to protect the rights of the children. And my child clients have always received asylum when they've been adjudicated in front of the officers because they understand. The judges are a totally different story. The judges either don't know or don't care, most of them, not all of them. but the idea that children are treated like adults in the courts in the U.S. They don't have a right to lawyers. They are, in fact, expected to represent themselves if they don't have a lawyer. I don't know how many of you know about, there's a television show in the United States called Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, and he did a really fantastic expose about this exact issue, about children having to represent themselves in court and the outrageous statements that some people had made that, oh yeah, 3-year-olds can understand asylum law, it's hard, but they can do it. So there was one woman who actually, she's a friend of mine, she has a young child, and she videotaped her child, and she was asking her child the kinds of questions you would ask an asylum applicant giving testimony on the stand. And she said to her daughter, would you like to designate a country of removal? And her little girl goes, pizza. So I thought about showing you guys that, but then I was like, well, I could just tell the story. So so we acknowledged and we implicitly agreed to this proclamation, right, in the convention, that children should grow up in a family environment, that there's love and understanding. And I'm bringing this up now because later in my presentation I'm going to talk about how we detain children. We detain children in the U.S. We detain children. We put children in jail. People don't like to call it that, but that's what it is. It's jail. So in any case, this is the other part that gets me very upset is the convention, Article 3.1 states that in all actions concerning children, the best interest of the child shall be the primary consideration. So what is the best interest of the child? I don't know if this is in other areas of law or other countries, but in the United States in our family law system, the best interest of the child is paramount. Whenever you have like a custody issue, when you have divorce and custody, you ask what is in the best interest of the child. And the United States Supreme Court, there's this case, it's called Reno versus Flores, which is still being litigated. And again, I could do I have taught a whole class on the Flores case because it has been going on since 1986. It's Reno was it 1986? Yeah, it's Reno versus Flores now. It started out as Nice versus Flores when Ronald Reagan was president. That gives you an idea how long ago that was, 40 years ago, right? But the Supreme Court, what was challenged was the idea that children shouldn't be incarcerated. This idea that children who are migrants who come to the U.S. without permission, if they're apprehended at the border, is it okay to put them in jail, essentially, while they're determining what to do with them? And so the Supreme Court said that the best interest of the child standard is not a requirement when justifying whether it's constitutional to incarcerate refugee children. The INS, which doesn't exist anymore, the INS was abolished after September 11th, and now we have the Department of Homeland Security. Instead, INS was the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They had purported to always be acting in the best interest of the child. They said that that's what they were doing, that when they put children in detention, they were acting in their best interest. But they refused to release the children. In fact, they still refuse to release children in many circumstances. So they had basically, it went to the Supreme Court. There was an argument that it was unconstitutional to treat children this way. But the Supreme Court was like, well, it's probably not, perfect. But their exact words were, there is no constitutional need for a hearing to determine whether private placement would be better so long as institutional custody is good enough. And those words just haunt me, right? It really bothers me that we have a society in which our Supreme Court has looked at children and the incarceration of children and said, well, it's good enough. It's good enough. It may not be in their best interest, but it's good enough. I'm not satisfied with that, and I'm not willing to let it go. Maybe I'm fighting a losing battle, but it continues to really upset me. So in any case, that is to this day a standard. And the reason there's so much litigation around it, and we'll talk about it when I talk about family detention centers, is that the government agreed. They agreed to hold themselves to a certain set of standards for what do they have to do to meet this good enough level. And they're just not doing it. They're just not very consistent at all with how they treat children. And my argument, too, is that this good enough standard directly contradicts the obligations that the United States assumed when it voluntarily signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think that even though we didn't ratify it, we drafted it, we signed it, we are obligated to honor it. And again, I think this good enough standard is a betrayal of the human rights of children, refugee children. So we have, and part of the whole Flores thing is this distinction between an unaccompanied child and an accompanied child. And so what is an unaccompanied child? The Flores litigation was at heart about unaccompanied children, children that come without adults, children that come to the U.S. by themselves. So there's a recognition that these children are young migrants and that they deserve certain special protections. And they do have certain special protections under the law. But, right, some of the problems come with who is an unaccompanied child, who is accompanied. For example, you can come with an adult who's not your parent and be unaccompanied. Or you can come with one parent, not the other, and be an unaccompanied child. It just depends, but usually it's whether you're with a parent or a guardian. And, most of these kids in the U.S. nowadays are coming from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, but they can be from any country. Right now in the U.S. there's a lot of unaccompanied minors from Afghanistan. I represent 3 unaccompanied refugee minors from Afghanistan. They were boys that were separated in the evacuation that happened in Afghanistan. They were with their whole family, and they got on a plane and their family got left behind. And they ended up here by themselves. They're teenagers. So they can be from any country, but the vast majority have been from Central America. So again, they've been fleeing violence, private violence from the Northern Triangle. Again, there's a lot of controversy in the U.S. and around the world, but in the U.S. about what is whether if you're fleeing private violence, that is okay, that is sufficient to get asylum. So this is a chart I've got about, again, it's a little bit old, but unaccompanied migrant children encountered from 2009 to 2005. You can see the rise, and it ends in 2015, and this chart, even though it's a little bit old, it's very critical because that 2014, 2015 years was, I'm sorry, I cut off the years at the top, but that's 2014, 2015, then, maybe it's 2016, I don't know, but you can see the dramatic drop, it's because the U.S. called it a surge, right? We said we had this surge of kids like coming across the border. They made it seem like, oh, they're surging across the border, they're fleeing here. It's like so many of them. And that was the rationale that the government used to open these family detention centers, which, like I said, I'll discuss in a couple minutes. So, right, they're leaving their home countries, right, because of, in the Northern Triangle is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. That's the Northern Triangle, right? So, you know, our government likes to say that, well, they're just fleeing poverty. Well, they're just coming for economic reasons. But that, of course, is not true. They're coming because, you know, there's femicide, there's, you know, gang violence, there's domestic violence. There's lots of reasons that are happening that the government is unable or unwilling to control. And our clients are not safe. They're not safe in their home countries, and they are forced to flee. Again, they don't want to leave their country. Nobody wants to leave their country, right? But they have a choice between living and dying, and they choose to live. So, right, again, kids may have multiple reasons for living their country. Again, the gang violence, cartel violence. The gang is kind of a misnomer. It's more like organized crime, national criminal syndicates, you know, very, very sophisticated gangs, right? In Central America, the gangs are pretty much law enforcement. So it's not something that can be controlled. Again, in El Salvador, lots of the kids who were returned from Mexico, and by the way, Mexico does a lot of our dirty work. They're doing it right now. They just kind of like trap the people trying to get in the border and just send them back, return them. We have all kinds of agreements with Mexico. But yeah, they said, why'd you come here? Crime, gang, and insecurity generally for leaving. Just no future, right? Just no future that they can see. So this brings us back to what are our obligations under international law? So again, we have entered into these treaties. Again, they're voluntary. Nobody forced us to sign these treaties. We signed them ourselves. 1951, of course, the 1951 Convention, the 1967 Protocol are the ones that everybody knows about. But again, you may not return someone to a country where he or she faces persecution. That's refoulement. I don't speak French either, so I'm sorry if I'm misspeaking. But withholding of removal, but called English. And then, of course, asylum, right? Somebody who can't go back to their country based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. That's really my expertise, is making arguments that people from these countries are not able to return to their country based on their membership in a particular social group. That body of law is, I think it's controversial around the world, right? My students always ask me, why is gender not in there? Why is gender missing? And I'm like, well, gender has to be squeezed into membership in a particular social group. But you can squeeze a lot of things into membership in a particular social group. And so, if you're interested in international law, I think it's a very exciting area of law to try to change and develop. In fact, it can be depressing sometimes, but it can also be like wildly imaginative, creative, and very exciting, right? Like I said, you have to take your licks and your hits as you go along, because you don't always win. But and the Convention Against Torture also prohibits the return of people to a country where they may be tortured, and that tends to be that's the Hail Mary for the American football. I'm sorry, but like the last shot, right? You throw it when you have no other chance. That's what you do when you have Convention Against Torture relief, at least in the United States. So we have these treaties. They form the basis of our refugee program and our asylum law. So all of our domestic law in the U.S. is based on international law. Our domestic courts don't like to hear international law arguments. They kind of like, we don't care about international law. We know that, but we make the arguments anyway. There are bars in our law to people to receive asylum. Asylum is actually a discretionary remedy in American law. You can actually meet all of the elements to receive asylum, and a judge can be like, but I don't like you because you wore a green shirt, so I'm not going to give you asylum. But refoulement and Convention Against Torture are non-discretionary. So if you meet your burden for demonstrating that form of relief, they must give it to you. But it's a higher burden than asylum. My thinking is that we have to, not just for protecting refugee kids, we have to make sure that these kids have an understanding of their rights, to give them adequate representation, which again, like I said, is not happening. Kids are going to court every day without lawyers. The biggest question is, do these children even qualify for protections under international and U.S. law? So again, most of the kids are coming, and they are eligible for humanitarian relief. We have several humanitarian forms of relief in the U.S. that are not asylum. that are created for vulnerable people and kids. Some are just for children. So I'll talk a little bit about those. The UNHCR did a survey where 58% of the children from the Northern Triangle had been forcibly displaced because they suffered or faced harm that would require international protection. So they're not going to be protected in their home countries, and we have an obligation to protect these children. And they would qualify for forms of relief as victims of trafficking, human trafficking, and crime victims. And we do have special remedies in the U.S. for children who have been trafficked, who are crime victims, and who have been abused or abandoned by their parents. And so one of the things I'm very interested in doing is educating people about this forms of relief, especially the last one, which I'll talk about in a second. It's called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. People don't know that these laws exist. And so when lawyers, even well-meaning lawyers, are screening children for protection, they don't screen them for these forms of relief because they don't know that they exist. And so I've been trying to get people to learn about them. So the types of stuff that they qualify for, again, it can be hard. It can be hard, right, to talk to kids because children are traumatized. They don't want to talk about what's going on. Sometimes they don't even know what happened, right? Like when I would talk to children in the detention centers, they didn't know why they left. Like they were just told they had to leave and they fled. So it can be hard to kind of get stories out of kids. It can be time consuming, but I think we have to do it. We have to put the time in. Again, that book, the first quote I gave from, she was the woman who wrote that book. She was an interpreter in the detention centers for the children, helping lawyers learn these children's stories. So again, it's hard work, but it can be done. So again, asylum, obviously, if they have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of the protected grounds. Special immigrant juvenile status. Now, this is a form of relief that was passed by our Congress in the United States, our Congress that can't do anything, almost defaulted our debt a couple days ago, but they somehow managed to get it together and pass this law. It's a humanitarian form of relief for non-citizen minors who've been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parents. When this law first started, it was both parents, but then they changed it to, and again, it still blows my mind that it was able to get this through both houses of Congress and signed by a president, that they can get this relief. It could be under 21, because in immigration law in the U.S., a child is someone who's under 21 and unmarried. The age of majority generally is 18, so this is a very generous standard. And they have to go through the state courts to get a dependency order saying that they are dependent on the court for, you have one parent and that parent has been given guardianship, you've been abandoned, abused, or neglected by the other court. But it's a beautiful remedy because as soon as you get that state order, you can apply to the immigration service and you get your residency, you get your permanent residency. And then 5 years after that, you can become a citizen. And my conspiracy theory about all these children that they're holding captive in jails on the border is that they don't want these kids to come in at all because they don't want them to get green cards and they don't want them to become citizens. That's my personal belief. Because right now in the U.S., there's all these white supremacists that are concerned about the browning of America, right? And they're like, oh no, all these kids coming up from, the South, and they're going, no, yeah, well, it's over. I mean, it's already happened. It's done. It's a done deal. And these children have this remedy available to them. I'm like, you can not like the law, but it is the law. It is the law, and we have to follow it. And so this is like my certain special mission to get those kids out of the detention centers and get them the protection that they deserve, that we voluntarily have given them. I think that's the thing that makes me the maddest, right? It's like nobody forced us to do this. We did it ourselves. U visas. So this is the crime victim visa. It's not just for children. This is for anybody who's a victim of a crime. You have to show that they have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse and that they cooperated with law enforcement. I've gotten lots of people approved for U visas, but Congress, once again, has a cap. There's only 10,000 of those visas given every year. So right now, the wait is something like 10 years for a visa. So yeah, it's terrible. Again, Congress can change that like that. All they got to do is lift the number, and President Biden promised to do that when he was running for president. He's like, I will lift the U visa cap. That hasn't happened. Maybe someday. And T visas are actually less common. They're easier and harder to get. It depends on the facts. I've done T visas, but I've only done labor trafficking because I used to work with farm workers, and so all of my clients have been forced labor. But most of them are sex trafficking. So you just have to demonstrate that you would suffer extreme hardship involving unusual or severe harm if you were removed from the United States. Those visas are, like I said, sometimes easier and sometimes harder to get. They don't have the same. They're not as well known as U visas. Actually, in Washington, where I live, most people who get T visas work in the embassies, which is, people are like, oh my God, that's shocking, but it's really not that shocking when you think about it. Domestic slavery, so it's trafficking. And this is the law that was passed that led to the SIJS stuff, right? The Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Look at how many times it's been reauthorized. Look at all those presidents who just like keep re-signing it. They're like, we love kids, we love kids. Right. But at the same time, you've got the Border Patrol, who's on the border not adequately screening these kids. They're just turning them right back around and being like, go back to where you came from. You're not eligible for anything here, which is just a lie. It's just not true. Again, they're supposed to be screened for everything. I spent a lot of time on the border, and I can assure you they're not screened properly. And the TVPRA applies to all kids except from Mexico and Canada. I don't know why. I think it has something to do with NAFTA, probably, the North American Free Trade Agreement, but that's just my guess. Makes sense. But if you are from a non-contiguous country, you end up in the custody of Health and Human Services. They are the ones who run the refugee program as well. So they actually do a pretty good job of releasing these children as soon as possible. All of my children who've been apprehended at the border have been transferred expeditiously to HHS from ICE custody. After, ICE custody, ICE is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Those are the pictures you see of the children laying on the floor with the Mylar blankets. That's ICE. That's not HHS. But they get those kids out of there pretty quickly, as quick as they can. The pushback tends to be from ICE, not HHS. They're the ones who do the screening for trafficking. They do a pretty good job of sending the kids to, most of the time it's to their parents who are already in the U.S. They will release them to family members. If they don't have family, they'll release them to either a shelter or one of the great things in Utah is there's a refugee foster care program, so they have families that are like substitute families that take care of the kids, and they live in a home-like environment. My 3 Afghan boys had all been in refugee foster care. So, which is better, right? I think that is in the best interest of the child. I think that is actually something the government is doing to live up to the best interest of the child standard, but the refugee foster care programs don't really exist in most places. There's very few programs to do that. But it's a pretty good one. So, the other good thing about the TVPRA is that it made it so that children don't have to comply with certain rules regarding asylum eligibility. I think the biggest one is that they don't have to comply with the 1-year filing deadline. In the U.S., if you don't file for your asylum application within a year of your arrival, you're technically not eligible, but they've recognized that that's not, well, for at least for kids, it's not a doable thing. For most people, it's not doable, but especially for children. And then this is, a lot of words, right? Requires HHS to ensure that to the, quote, greatest extent practicable that unaccompanied children in their custody get legal counsel, right? Not just to represent them in legal proceedings, but to prevent them from being mistreated, exploited, and trafficked. I mean, that's really lovely, right? To the greatest extent practicable. But they're not, it's not, these kids have to go out and find their own lawyers. And lawyers are generally not free. And even if there are, there's not enough free lawyers. How are they treated, right, when they get here? Again, you go into removal proceedings in front of an immigration judge. This is an old statistic, but it remains true. Most people who were removed from the United States, who were deported, never even went to court. We have this thing called expedited removal, which allows the border patrol to just turn you around. If they find you within 100 miles of the border, they can just be like, just go back to where you came from, without any kind of process, without any kind of opportunity to make your case. Again, and our Supreme Court has said that's totally fine. That's a whole other conversation for another day. Again, most of the kids, like adults, are caught at the border. But the unaccompanied kids can't be put into expedited removal because of the TVPRA. So the kids are not going to get turned around, which again goes back to my conspiracy theory about keeping them warehoused in those shelters on the border and then finding a way to get them out other ways. So it's 72 hours we're supposed to be out of and put in HHS custody. And, again, they have to be screened by the Border Patrol about persecution, because back to the non-discretionary remedies, you cannot return anybody to their home country if they fear persecution in their home country. So we try to do that. But, if a kid from Mexico or Canada, they are supposed to do that with them too, but then they put them into something called voluntary return. And this is, again, agreements that we have with Mexico and Canada that I frankly just don't know enough about, because I do have Mexican clients, but I don't have anybody from Canada, shockingly. So when they're in custody, these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations, I work for non-governmental organizations. I have this whole idea of the idea that Border Patrol is doing these screenings is kind of a joke, because they're not really doing it. There's also concern that our repatriation agreements with Mexico is kind of more about things that are not have nothing to do with child welfare. So again, back to the attorney stuff. Kids can't get lawyers. I've already told you that. There's 38,000 in 2015. There were 38,000 pending cases for kids that were unrepresented. And children are not supposed to be in court. That's the other thing. There's been agreements that children are supposed to, if they're put in court, they're supposed to be removed voluntarily to the asylum offices. When Donald Trump was president, that was like totally out the window. We would be like, there's been this practice historically of giving children a shot in a non-adversarial venue first, and they were just like, no, we're not doing that anymore. But they are now. But again, when Obama was president, they weren't even put in court proceedings, or if they were, the government was like, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to put them in court, it was an accident. President Biden is putting the kids in court, and we're having to make good cause motions to get them out of court and into the asylum interviews. So that, again, it's a different. I was telling somebody the other day, like, President Biden is not as bad as Trump, but he's not as good as Obama, at least on immigration. So take that for what you will. So this brings me back to detention. So, like, why do we detain the families, right? Again, no one disagrees that we're having a humanitarian refugee crisis. Everybody agrees it's a crisis. No one's saying it's not. The argument is, like, what do we do with it? Like, what should we do? How do we deal with it? What do we do? Now, my next slide is my fun slide. Yeah, look at those guys. Aren't they cool? Yeah. This is my favorite, like Jay Johnson. He was the secretary of DHS. This is what he actually said. Those of you contemplating coming here illegally, we will send you back. People in Central America should see and will see that if they make this journey and spend several $1,000s to do that, we send them back and they will have wasted their money. And then Uncle Joe, very cool guy in the middle, who's our current president. June 2014. None of these women or children will be eligible. He's wrong. He's just wrong. They're both wrong. They're both wrong. I have been doing this litigation for many years. For the last decade, all I've done is represent women and kids from Central America. That's all I've done. Do you know how many cases I've lost? Zero. We've won all of our cases because they are eligible. And they're not wasting their money, and they are refugees, and their lives are in danger. It's not because I'm a great lawyer, it's because they are refugees, and we made a case, and they won their cases. So again, don't get me wrong, I like Joe, and I like Barack. But if I call them by their first name because clearly we're close friends. But if I ever had like some time alone with them, this is what I would ask them. I'd be like, why did you say that, Joe? Because he's a compassionate person. I believe that. But he's just wrong. And Barack Obama, if I ever have time with him, I'm going to ask him why he opened the family detention centers, which is what I'm going to talk about next, because the family detention centers just really are a shame. Our America should be very, very ashamed of what we've done there. So this is a brief history of family detention. So there used to be just one, and it was in Berks County, Pennsylvania. It was opened in 2001, and it just closed down last year. I've been to all of these except for, so I've been to the three. I've been to Berks, Carnes, and Dilley. I have not been to Hutto. I was on my way to Artesia when they shut it down. Artesia was a disaster. It was only open for 3 months, or 6 months, so I didn't get there in time. But Hutto, Hutto was terrible, but Burks for a while was the only one. So family detention, right? It came to my attention during the Bush administration, George W. Bush, the second Bush, because Hutto was a big disaster because they accidentally detained a Canadian kid. And so like people were trying to get it shut down, but of course the American press wasn't interested. And so the University of Texas, their law clinic was there helping the families there, and they found out that there was this child from Canada who had gotten detained. His whole family got detained because they were flying back to Canada, and like somebody on the plane died, and so the plane landed in Puerto Rico, and I forget, but they ended up getting detained, and so the Canadian press was outraged that this child was being detained, and so Canada got a whole bunch of media, and then the U.S. was like, oh, sorry, I'm so embarrassed because Canada thought we were like detaining children, which we are. But at that time, the kids, Hutto was bad because, well, I'll start with Burks because that was the first one. Burks was very small. It only held 96 people, but it was still, and it was licensed by the state. There was one place that provided the legal services there, the People Justice Center, Aldea. They're the ones who actually shut it down. They just never, for years and years, they just advocated to get it shut down, and they did get it shut down. The stuff that was happening there is the same stuff that happens in all of the family detention centers. Poor medical and dental health, sexual assault, suicide attempts, poor food and water. When I was in Dili, the first thing they told us was don't drink the water because it's like poison and you'll get really sick. Threats against the parents, inability to parent, re-traumatization, PTSD, inadequate education. They're supposed to educate the kids well now. That was one of the agreements in Reno versus Flores. And that's what I'm saying. This is all up here, like the medical care, the dental care, the food, the water, the education, the indigenous language issues, because so many people from the Northern Triangle speak indigenous languages rather than Spanish. They just don't do anything for them. So these are all violations of the government's own agreements to how to care for the kids in detention. They're good enough standard. So that was what was happening at Burks. Hutto was the first attempt to expand family detention. So again, this was George W. Bush. Hutto was a former prison, which had been the norm. All these detention centers had been prisons. When they opened Dili was like built especially for this reason. Like, again, this is what I want to ask Barack Obama if I ever get about 2 minutes alone with him. Like, why did you do that? But the other time ones were just prisons. Again, they opened it because this was when they were redoing really the expedited removal along the southern border. But like I said, they got a lot of bad press when the Canadian thing happened because the Canadian journalists went in there and again, I'm always amazed that the government allows people with cameras and stuff into these facilities because they should be very ashamed. But they counted them like you in a prison. No medical care, no education. The children weren't allowed to have toys. They couldn't have crayons to play or draw. And they put the children in little mini prison outfits, with the black and white stripes like you see in cartoons and stuff. Yeah. I used to have it, and I can't find it. I used to have a picture of a child wearing the stripes. It was horrific. And so again, once Canada got a hold of all this stuff, it was over for Hutto because it was a pretty much a PR disaster. And so Obama got elected president, and this is why I'm so confused with President Obama. He's the one who shut it down at the very beginning of his presidency, 2009. He was like, oh, this is horrible. Family detention is inhumane. It's a disaster. So, after, all this advocacy, there was litigation, there were lawsuits. I could tell you all about it, but instead I'll just tell you that they ended it. The Obama administration ended family detention in August 2009, and Burks was the only place left. And for a while, Burks was only for people who didn't have, asylum seekers who didn't have anybody they could be released to. And so it wasn't supposed to be like a punitive detention thing. It was supposed to be just like families who had nowhere else to go. So Obama, at the beginning of his presidency, was like, well, this is bad, we're not going to do it. But then they totally changed their tune. When this surge happened, right, in 2014, they started Artesia, New Mexico. They put this big family detention center in Artesia, New Mexico. I never made it there. Like I said, I was on my way with my students. But Artesia was in the literal middle of nowhere. It was like 4 hours by car from Santa Fe, New Mexico, or Albuquerque, New Mexico, and 4 hours by car from El Paso, Texas. So it was in the middle of the desert. There was no cell phone service. There was nothing. No access to lawyers. Lawyers and law students just were, they're the ones who blew the whistle on this, and we did get some media involved. But again, no lawyers, just very depressing. Again, there's Amy Goodwin, who's a journalist in the U.S. She did some really good reporting on it. But it was so bad that the administration shut it down within 6 months. But that was because they had a backup plan. Their backup plans were called Cairn City and Dili. So I've been to Cairn City twice with my students, working with Raíces. Raíces, you may have heard of Raíces because when the family separation crisis happened in 2018, when Trump was kidnapping kids, Raíces is the organization that was really involved in helping reunite the children and families, and they're the ones who ended up getting the biggest amount of money raised. I think they're a very, very small organization, and somebody on Facebook raised $20 million for them, which was unreal. But they've been working at Cairn City for a long time. It's run by a private prison contractor, so it is a prison. I've been there, like I said, twice. They have airlocks. It is a jail. And then Dili, which is actually called the South Texas Family Residential Center. Doesn't that sound lovely? Doesn't that sound like homey? I mean, in the waiting area, they have these little artistic renderings of families sitting together by a fire, and you're just it actually looks like a concentration camp with barbed wire. That's what it is. 2,400 moms and kids. That's a lot of people, right? It was built 2014 and 2015, operated by the Corrections Corporations of America, which has a different name now. They have a name that's now it's CCA Cares or something warm and fuzzy, but they're not warm and fuzzy. They're a for-profit contractor, and they make a lot of money on this. Like everything, it's all about money. But lawyers, we had this thing called the Dili Pro Bono Project, again, trying to help the moms and kids. And it was just mothers and kids. They would forcibly separate families. If you came as a family unit, the fathers were down the road at a detention center, and then the moms and kids were alone in the family center. And this was harmful for a couple reasons, mostly because the men were getting deported rather fast, but also because a lot of times the women and kids didn't know even why they had fled, because the fathers were trying to protect them and not tell them what happened. And in fact, one of the things that I noticed when I was down there was that the asylum officers, so the way it works is first an asylum officer will interview you, and the asylum officers were only interviewing the moms, and the moms often didn't have anything. And so when I would review their stuff after they were, you have to get what's called a credible fear determination, and a lot of times the asylum officers were saying that they didn't have a credible fear of return. And I would ask the moms, I said, did they talk to your kids? They were like, no. They said they didn't need to talk to my kids. And I was like, let me talk to your kids. The kids had a lot of information. A lot of times the kids had information about what was going on. So I'm sure that a lot of women and their children were deported because the asylum officers were not properly interviewing the children. The children see a lot of terrible things, and they will tell you. The way I would talk to the students, they're the students. The children is, I would ask them to do homework for me. If they were, I'd be like, can you do some homework? Can you either draw me a picture or just tell me a story about what your life was like in Honduras, right before you came here. And I mean, it was heartbreaking and sad, but they had information to share and something to tell. And the thing is, if the mother doesn't have a credible fear and the child does, they both have to be released. So sometimes we would have situations where the mother didn't pass her credible fear, but the child did. So that's the other thing people don't understand, is that children are independent human beings with their own independent credible fears. And lawyers need to learn to screen the kids separate and apart from their parents, even when the asylum officers don't. So I thought family detention was the worst thing ever, and then family separation happened. And that was so horrible, because this was this zero tolerance policy. Sessions, the former Attorney General of the U.S., Jeff Sessions, this zero tolerance policy in which the Trump administration decided they were going to have universal prosecutions of illegal entry and illegal re-entry. So entering the United States without permission technically is a crime, but it's also a civil violation. Most people who get put in deportation proceedings are only charged with civil violations, right? Being present without authorization is a civil violation. Entering under 1325 is a misdemeanor, so it's a very low-level crime. Re-entering, so you've come in, you've been deported, and you came back, is a felony with, I think it's 2 years in federal prison as a punishment, so it's no joke. But very few people get prosecuted. very few people get prosecuted because it's just not, I mean, if you're a prosecutor, you have to make decisions about what's worth your time. It's just not worth your time to prosecute all those things. We don't have the resources, frankly, we don't have enough lawyers. Because unlike immigration, in the US, when you are charged with a criminal offense, you have a right to counsel at the government's expense. Oh, that. And that's eventually why Trump's little scheme fell apart, because they just didn't have enough federal public defenders. They just didn't have enough lawyers to give the universal representation. So it fell apart on practical grounds, not because Trump's a good guy. I know that's shocking. But yeah, there were family separations happening before this was going on, but it became really widespread after this. That's the infamous cover of our magazine with Trump. It's photos. It wasn't, he wasn't actually standing in front of this child, right? It was a Photoshop, but I think it conveys pretty powerfully like what was happening in our country at that time. And our Congress is talented. If they're not good at anything else, they're very good at naming their bills the exact opposite of what they actually are. So they called this executive order affording Congress an opportunity to address family separation. That was an executive order, so it wasn't the Congress, it was the president, but same thing. It didn't end zero tolerance. There was just no plan how to prosecute these people. They didn't have enough lawyers, and then also they didn't know how they were going to detain them long enough. By this time, Reno versus Flores had gone through several different more iterations, and a federal judge in California, Dolly G, had said that people could only be detained for kids could only be detained for a maximum of 20 days, and they didn't know how they were going to comply with that, and also send all the parents to jail. It was just a logistical nightmare, and so they had to kind of not cry uncle, but they kind of gave up. The other thing is there was so much litigation going on. I think the most important ones are the ones where the courts actually recognized about the psychological harm that was happening to these kids, and I continue to think that that's the biggest harm. That's the biggest harm that we can never fix. That's the sin that I think we're going to pay for. We are paying for. Again, you can read what they said. The ways these children have been irreparably harmed is stuff that's not going to be fixed ever. We've done grave harm to these kids, and that this is long-term consequences that these kids are going to live with for the rest of their lives, even after they're reunited with their parents. There's been a lot of good journalism about children, being mad at their parents, thinking they let it happen to them. Some of them not remembering their parents, depending on how old they are when they were reunited with them. Just, horrible, awful, heartbreaking stuff. Again, toxic stress, long-lasting harm. This is my last slide, so I'm done almost. Thank you for hanging with me. But, so this is, I guess, my final conclusion. Even though the convention, right, says that arrest and detention of these kids should be like a last resort, the last thing we should do, it's not been a last resort, it's been like the first thing we do. It's the first thing we do. And not just Trump, but Biden and Barack Obama and George W. Bush. It's the last 4 administrations have all engaged in detaining refugees. And you could go back to Reagan. Like I said, it started with him, but even Reagan was better than these guys. So again, my argument is that if we're going to actually act in the best interest of the kids, or even the good enough standard, we got to stop doing this, because we're systematically violating their human rights and doing lots of harm that can't be repaired. And so we've abdicated our responsibility to the convention, and we need to protect the human rights of children. That's it. Obrigado.
Thank you so much, Professor Campbell, for bringing to our attention such an interesting and important aspect of the immigration law of the United States. Now, eu gostaria de dar a palavra ao professor Igor, que vai seguir com a sua exposição. Seja muito bem-vindo novamente à Universidade Federal de Uberlândia, professor Igor, e que seja um momento muito interessante e frutífero para nós.
Muito obrigado. Boa noite a todos. É uma grande alegria estar aqui com vocês para falar sobre questões tão importantes. Eu também pesquisei um pouco sobre a política externa dos Estados Unidos para refugiados. So I'm going to speak a little bit in English because of our professor. What I just said is that I also have researched a little bit about the U.S. Immigration law, but actually more focused on the U.S. refugee policy towards religious minorities from Iraq and the Middle East. And unfortunately, we can see a similar pattern despite of signing a lot of international treaties and international law, the U.S. keeps using the refugee policy according to their own interests, according to their own national interests. And we see that in the way that the policies they are drafted concerning the nationalities that are going to be accepted, how many of them according to the religion. So Trump, for example, said he would resettle more Christians, but then he dropped the number of refugees who are being resettled. So even the Christians that were accepted during the Trump administration were smaller the number than during the Obama administration. Right now with Biden, the numbers haven't increased yet. So it's something that's happening in different administrations, not only the Republicans or the Democrats, but it's a trend, a pattern that you can see since the 1980s. And it's interesting because one of the reasons why the US created the refugee law was exactly to avoid the refugee policy being used to achieve different interests, because in the context of the Cold War, they were settling only people coming from communist countries. And what's sad is because if you have a country like the US, it's a democracy that has signed all these international treaties, and they're treating refugees in this way, imagine the countries that are not even part of the Refugee Convention. And that's why I want to talk a little bit tonight. Bom, pessoal, como eu estava falando, né, não sei quantos de vocês falam inglês, então eu vou falar em português. A minha pesquisa de doutorado foi justamente sobre a política dos Estados Unidos para refugiados do Oriente Médio, com foco nas minorias religiosas. Mas o meu trabalho com refugiados e com essa temática das migrações forçadas, ela vem praticamente desde quando eu entrei na Faculdade de Relações Internacionais. Eu me lembro que quando eu entrei na Faculdade de Relações Internacionais em 2011, eu sou formado na UPB, na Universidade Estadual da Paraíba, e era no auge da Primavera Árabe. E não sei quantos vocês fazem simulações aqui de instituições internacionais, mas a primeira simulação que eu participei foi do Acnur, que é o Alto Comissariado das Nações Unidas para Refugiados. E era no início ali da Primavera Árabe, a Guerra da Síria estava no início, e esse é um tema que eu tenho pesquisado desde então. E hoje eu queria então falar um pouco com vocês sobre qual é a situação dos refugiados no mundo. A gente tem o tema, né, sobre o sul global, e a maioria das crises de refugiados e, consequentemente, a maior população de refugiados se encontra justamente nesse sul global. Então, quando eu comecei a pesquisar refugiados, lá em 2012, por aí, de acordo com a Acnur, havia no mundo cerca de 40 milhões de pessoas em situações de deslocamento forçado. Hoje esse número já é de quase 89 milhões. Isso dobrou aí em praticamente 10 anos, é mais do que dobrou. E a principal região do mundo onde isso acontece é no Oriente Médio, além que, claro, a gente tem um exemplo aqui recente que é a Venezuela, tem outros casos também como a Ucrânia, na África, na Ásia, mas os principais, né, que a gente olha para ver, o Oriente Médio é uma região que historicamente tem produzido esses deslocamentos forçados, e é por isso, né, que eu trabalho hoje também com o LEON, que é o Laboratório de Estudos do Oriente Médio, que é o primeiro think tank brasileiro focado somente no Oriente Médio. É uma iniciativa da VIII, então, já deixando aqui de antemão, quem tiver interesse em querer aprender mais sobre o Oriente Médio, sobre essas temáticas que eu vou falar aqui hoje, vocês podem depois olhar, procurar o LEON, e a VIII tem várias iniciativas para jovens estudantes como vocês que têm interesse nesse tema. Bom, como eu falei, hoje a gente tem vivido a maior crise de deslocamento forçado da história desde a Segunda Guerra Mundial. Então, quando a gente para pensar, o mundo hoje ele tem mais pessoas fora de suas casas do que em qualquer outro momento da história. E quando a gente pensa, né, sobre essa questão do deslocamento, de refugiados, migrantes, a gente tem, primeiro, algumas dificuldades conceituais. Como a professora bem falou, um dos grandes problemas que a gente tem nos Estados Unidos é justamente essa definição de quem é um refugiado e quem não é. E por que é tão importante a gente falar sobre essas definições do direito internacional? Porque, como ela demonstrou, se aquele imigrante ele não é considerado um refugiado, então o país ele deixa de ter certas responsabilidades e certas obrigações com aquela pessoa. Então ela pode ser simplesmente devolvida para o seu país de origem, sem que isso seja considerado uma violação do direito internacional. E além disso, a gente tem outras categorias de deslocados forçados que não se enquadram na definição atual de refugiado. Então, a primeira coisa que torna um refugiado diferente de um migrante comum E isso é um grande problema que às vezes a gente vê na mídia, né? Os jornalistas não têm muitas vezes um preparo quando vão cobrir questões de refugiados, eles usam refugiados e imigrantes como sinônimos, não são. O migrante é alguém que sai da sua casa, sai do seu país de origem de modo voluntário. Talvez muitas vezes eles vão por questão de querer ter uma melhora financeira ou algo do tipo, mas é algo que é voluntário. Ele não está fugindo por conta de uma ameaça à sua vida, por conta de algum tipo de perseguição. Então a gente já tem uma distinção entre os migrantes e os que são deslocados forçados, como a ONU tem chamado. E dentro dos deslocados forçados, os principais, quando a gente pensa, são os refugiados. E, de fato, a gente tem hoje no mundo cerca de 27 milhões de refugiados. E o que é, então, um refugiado? Como a professora mencionou, a gente tem a Convenção de Genebra, de 1951, depois a gente teve também um protocolo adicional de 1967, que considera como refugiado qualquer pessoa que, em virtude de perseguição ou de um temor bem fundado de perseguição, deixa o seu país de origem e atravessa uma fronteira nacional. E os tipos de perseguição que são tipificados, que são colocados nessa lei, perseguição por pertencimento a um grupo social, ou então por questão étnica, questão religiosa, questão política, e isso acaba gerando aí várias lacunas, né? Até porque, como eu vou falar mais à frente, essa definição que ela foi criada num contexto pós-Segunda Guerra Mundial, então ela certamente não abarca aí vários outros desafios que a gente tem hoje, né? Como as questões de gênero, as questões, né, a população LGBTQIA+, que em muitos países sofre por conta dessa condição da sua orientação sexual, da sua identidade de gênero, e precisa sair do seu país de origem. Mas além desses refugiados, né, que são um número muito grande, né, 27 milhões, dentro deles a gente ainda tem um outro tipo específico de refugiado, que eu vou explicar melhor daqui a pouco, que são os refugiados palestinos, que eles têm um mandato diferente da ONU, uma organização da ONU específica para eles, e eles também têm uma definição diferente do que seria refugiado. Mas fora isso, uma grande população que acaba sendo muitas vezes ignorada são dos deslocados internos. Existem cerca de 53 milhões de deslocados internos no mundo. E o que é um deslocado interno? Um deslocado interno é alguém que foge pelos mesmos motivos que um refugiado, mas também por motivos adicionais do que um refugiado. Só que ele, diferente do refugiado, ele não atravessa a fronteira internacional. Ele fica dentro do seu próprio país de origem. Então, por exemplo, quando a gente teve a ascensão do Estado Islâmico em 2014, no Iraque, na Síria, muitas pessoas fugiram no Iraque, mas elas não se tornaram refugiados, porque elas saíram daqueles territórios que o Estado Islâmico havia conquistado, que eram territórios, né, em sua maioria árabe, e eles foram para o Kurdistão. E o Kurdistão, ele é uma área, uma região semi-autônoma do Iraque, mas ele não conseguiu a sua independência. Então eles ficaram deslocados internamente. Por eles estarem deslocados internamente, eles não ficam debaixo aí da proteção que os refugiados têm. Eles não têm essas mesmas leis, a comunidade internacional não tem esse compromisso direto com eles. A gente vê que existe um regime internacional, né, existem normas, existem regras em relação a como cuidar dos refugiados. Um desses princípios é justamente o non-refoulement, não devolver aquelas pessoas que pedem o refúgio. Mas no caso dos locados internos, tudo que a gente tem são princípios orientadores. E então, se com tratados que são juridicamente vinculantes, a gente já vê que eles não são respeitados, imagina só esses que são normas, que são sugestões. Por outro lado, os locados internos, eles têm uma proteção que os refugiados não têm, que seria a legislação local do seu próprio país. Só que a gente está falando de países em que a situação não é das melhores, então eles muitas vezes não são aparados nem mesmo pelas suas próprias legislações dos seus países. A gente não fala muito sobre isso, mas o Brasil, a gente tem deslocados internos, sim. E quando a gente fala sobre deslocados internos no Brasil, eu venho da Paraíba, então essa é uma realidade muito comum de pessoas que têm que fugir, por exemplo, da seca. Então elas precisam sair das suas casas em busca de água, de sustento para sobreviver. Eles são deslocados internos, mas não existe uma legislação brasileira que lide com isso diretamente, embora o Brasil ele assine tratados internacionais, né, tem conhecimento dessas normas que guiam o cuidado desses deslocados internos. Uma outra questão, também deslocados internos muito comum, são as pessoas aqui que são vítimas de catástrofes naturais ou até mesmo desastres humanos. Né, aqui em Minas Gerais, infelizmente, a gente tem vários casos, né, Brumadinho, Mariana. Então, todas as pessoas que perdem suas casas nessa situação, se tornam deslocados internos, e a gente vê quantos que estão aí que nunca receberam indenização, que não tiveram seus casos de volta. E um dos problemas é justamente porque não existe uma legislação hoje no Brasil que dê conta dos deslocados internos. Fora eles, a gente também tem cerca de 4,6 milhões de requerentes de refúgio, né? Asylum seekers. E o que seria isso? Aqui na América Latina, refúgio e asilo são características, são instituições diferentes. Quando a gente pega esses números da ONU, né, do Acnur, eles consideram como asylum seekers todas aquelas pessoas que pedem refúgio, né? Então, o requerente de refúgio é alguém que chega em um outro país e ele entra com um pedido de refúgio e fica esperando aí num limbo, às vezes demora 1 ano, 6 meses, por aí vai, para ser considerado refugiado ou não. Então, durante o período em que essa pessoa está com o processo de refúgio, ela não pode ser deportada. Então, essa é a grande dificuldade, como a professora mencionou, que aquelas crianças que chegam nos Estados Unidos, vindas da América Central, há esse esforço de dizer que elas não são refugiadas, que elas não se enquadram aí nessa condição de asylum seekers, então elas não têm sequer a possibilidade de fazer esse pedido de refúgio. Só que aqui na América Latina a gente tem uma outra instituição, que é o asilo político, e essa não tem necessariamente um tratado internacional, é o que cabe mais a cada país decidir se vai dar o asilo a alguém somente por motivo político ou não. E por fim, a gente tem uma outra não categoria, mas uma grande situação aí de deslocados forçados, que são os venezuelanos. A gente tem mais de 4 milhões de venezuelanos espalhados aqui pela América Latina, muitos deles aqui no Brasil, cerca de 70 mil morando aqui no Brasil, e eles são um impasse aí no direito internacional, porque alguns venezuelanos, eles realmente se enquadram na definição de refugiados da ONU, porque eles realmente estão fugindo de perseguição política, de perseguição ideológica, mas o que a gente tem visto é que muitos venezuelanos, eles fogem simplesmente por conta da fome, por conta da economia que está ruim, de uma situação de violação generalizada de direitos humanos, né? Vale ressaltar que quando a gente fala sobre violação de direitos humanos, a gente não está falando somente de falta de liberdade de imprensa, de liberdade religiosa, a gente também está falando sobre os direitos econômicos. Então, de acordo com a nossa lei de refúgio aqui no Brasil, o Brasil entende que situações como a da Venezuela, bem como situações como a da Síria, como teve também no caso do Haiti, são situações em que os direitos humanos, de modo geral, estão sendo violados. Então, qualquer nacional desse país, ele pode entrar com um pedido de refúgio. Só que, novamente, reconhecer essas pessoas como refugiadas significa que o governo brasileiro vai ter uma série de responsabilidades para com elas. Então, é muito mais fácil criar um visto especial para os haitianos, para os venezuelanos, do que reconhecê-los como refugiados, porque aí a responsabilidade seria muito maior. Então, esse é um dilema que a gente tem aqui na América Latina ao lidar com os venezuelanos, mas é um problema também que a gente tem no mundo inteiro, que é o quê? Os principais países que geram refugiados são países em que estão situados nessa região do chamado sul global. A gente sabe que sul global não é necessariamente uma descrição geográfica, né? É um conceito que a gente tem nas relações internacionais para falar sobre países subdesenvolvidos ou em desenvolvimento. E quando a gente para ver, 69%, né, quase 70% de todos esses deslocados forçados, eles vêm de apenas 5 países. E quais países são esses? A Síria, que tem cerca de quase 7 milhões de refugiados, né, uma guerra que começou em 2011, na chamada Primavera Árabe, mas que permanece até hoje. Na verdade, o mundo aceitou já o Bashar al-Assad, depois de ele ter cometido inúmeros crimes contra a humanidade, inclusive usando armas químicas contra a população, mas ele permanece no poder e está aí sendo normalizado novamente pelos países árabes em virtude aí, depois da guerra da Ucrânia. A gente tem a Venezuela, né, como eu falei, com mais de 4 milhões de deslocados forçados. A gente tem também o Afeganistão, com quase 3 milhões. O Afeganistão é um país que tem produzido aí deslocados forçados já desde do 11 de setembro, né, 2001, quando tem a invasão dos Estados Unidos, né, a chamada guerra ao terror, e agora com a retirada das tropas em 2021 a situação ficou muito pior, porque o Talibã ele voltou ao poder e a gente viu esse grande êxodo da população. A gente também tem o Sudão do Sul, com cerca de 2 milhões de refugiados, mais de 2 milhões de refugiados. O Sudão do Sul é um dos países mais recentes que a gente tem da comunidade internacional. Ele se tornou independente em 2009, se não me engano, depois de um referendo, depois aí de muitos conflitos com o Sudão, conflitos étnicos e religiosos, por conta que o Sudão é um país de maioria árabe e islâmica, e o Sul ele era uma população principalmente negra, mas também que seguia aí o cristianismo e outras religiões africanas. Só que essa divisão, essa independência do país, ela não significou que haveria ali uma paz necessariamente. Ele sempre estava entrando em conflito, e agora mesmo o Sudão ele está passando por uma outra crise política, um golpe que aconteceu. Então aí se temor de que gere-se aí uma nova onda também de refugiados do Sudão. E por fim, a gente tem o Mianmar, com mais de 1 milhão de refugiados. No caso do Mianmar, a gente tem uma tentativa de genocídio contra os muçulmanos Rohingya. Eles simplesmente não são considerados cidadãos do país, pelo fato deles serem de uma etnia e de um grupo religioso que não é reconhecido pelo Estado Mianmar, e eles ficam aí, tiveram que fugir. E quando a gente fala sobre refugiado, como já foi mencionado, a gente está falando sobre pessoas que elas têm que fugir para salvar a sua própria vida. Então, quando começa um conflito como a guerra da Síria, quando começa uma crise como a da Venezuela, uma tentativa de genocídio como essa no Mianmar, as pessoas elas não têm muito tempo, geralmente, para pensar para onde elas vão. E por mais que a gente viva hoje num mundo globalizado, em que as distâncias foram diminuídas por conta da tecnologia, mas existe um impasse, que é como você consegue visto para sair desses países, para ir para um outro país. Então, um dos grandes problemas da crise dos refugiados sírios, por exemplo, é porque eles não tinham visto para ir para outros países da Europa, eles precisavam ir para os países próximos. Então, eles começaram a ir para os países vizinhos, até que chegou um momento em que eles não tinham mais como, esses países receptores não tinham como recebê-los, eles tentam ir para a Europa. E como é que eles vão chegar lá? Eles recorrem aos traficantes de seres humanos, aos contrabandistas, porque os países que fazem parte, que assinam os tratados internacionais de refugiados, eles dizem, tudo bem, a gente, se alguém chegar aqui e pedir refúgio, ele não pode ser deportado. Mas como é que a pessoa vai chegar até esse local? E isso é um problema que a gente tem muito aqui no Brasil. O Brasil ele tem uma ótima legislação em relação aos refugiados, bastante avançada, mas como é que alguém vai chegar no Brasil para pedir um visto de refugiado, fazer um pedido de refúgio? Como é que alguém que está no Afeganistão, como é que alguém que está no Paquistão, que está no Mianmar, vai entrar no avião para chegar no Brasil e fazer esse pedido? Então, a gente agora tem a nova lei de migração, um dispositivo que é o visto humanitário, mas ainda assim ele não é tão bem regulamentado, depende aí do Itamaraty, quando ele vai permitir os embaixadores emitir, sempre tem que ter uma ordem em cima, não é algo tão fácil de acontecer. Então imagina países como os Estados Unidos, como na Europa. No caso dos Estados Unidos, só é aceito como refugiado lá quem já tem um status de refugiados concedidos pelo Acnur, já está em um segundo país, geralmente em campos de refugiados, passam por um processo de triagem e aí são reassentados no país. Então, quando a gente para ver, 83% desses refugiados eles se encontram em países que são aí subdesenvolvidos, países em desenvolvimento. 72% dos refugiados eles se encontram nos países vizinhos. E aí quando a gente para ver, somente a Turquia, ela tem 3,8 milhões de refugiados sírios. E isso tem um impacto não somente na economia do país, mas também tem um impacto até mesmo na política do país. A gente viu aí recentemente, a Turquia passou por eleições, o mundo inteiro dirigiu os olhos para a Turquia, porque a gente tem o Erdogan, que é um presidente aí bastante autoritário, que fez uma série de mudanças na Constituição da Turquia para ter mais poder. Então a gente tem visto aí o recrudescimento da liberdade de imprensa, dos direitos civis no país, e tinha-se uma grande expectativa de que o opositor dele fosse ganhar. Só que no segundo turno, uma das medidas do opositor foi justamente o quê? Foi apelar para o nacionalismo e até mesmo para a xenofobia, dizendo que se ele fosse eleito, ele iria expulsar de vez os refugiados sírios do país. E isso gera uma série de consequências da geopolítica. Por que é que os países europeus todos estavam ali congratulando o Erdogan por ter ganhado o terceiro termo nas eleições da Turquia? Porque essa tem sido a barganha que a Turquia tem feito com a Europa desde que a guerra da Síria começou, desde que a gente teve em 2015, aquela imagem do Alan Kurd, aquele menino sírio que morreu lá na praia da Turquia. Qual tem sido então a estratégia da Turquia? eles recebem os refugiados, mas eles impedem aí que esses refugiados vão para a Europa. Então a Europa fica nessa sinuca de bico, né, tendo que fingir que não está vendo os retrocessos que estão acontecendo na Turquia, porque eles estão mantendo esses refugiados lá. E no caso da Turquia, a situação é ainda mais complicada, porque a Turquia, juntamente com Israel e com o Egito, são os únicos países do Oriente Médio que eles assinam a Convenção de 51 e assinam também a cláusula, o protocolo adicional de 1967. Porque quando a lei de refúgio ela foi criada, esse regime internacional que a gente tem de refugiados, ele foi criado no contexto da Segunda Guerra Mundial. A gente teve um dos grandes problemas do Holocausto, foi justamente porque não tinham para onde aqueles judeus eles fugirem. Quando a gente vai falar sobre a solução final, sobre as políticas de Hitler, por mais que o antissemitismo sempre tivesse feito parte do seu discurso, foi o que contribuiu para que ele chegasse ao poder na Alemanha, mas a política da solução final, destruir os judeus, os campos de Auschwitz, aquilo não foi algo que foi pensado com antecedência. Aquilo foi algo que foi se desenrolando ao longo do tempo. E logo no início, do que a gente conhece como Holocausto, Hitler tentou convencer outros países a receber aqueles judeus. Ele queria expulsar os judeus da Europa, da Alemanha, e ele queria que os países recebessem. Inclusive, muitos judeus queriam ir para a Palestina, mas na época quem comandava lá era a Grã-Bretanha e colocou os White Papers, que proibiu a imigração dos judeus, inclusive depois da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Muita gente que sobreviveu ao Holocausto, que saiu dos campos de concentração de Auschwitz, eles acabaram morrendo em campos de refugiados no Chipre, porque não tinham acesso à Palestina. E aí é onde a gente vai ter o surgimento, depois, de um outro problema de refugiados, porque uma das consequências da Segunda Guerra Mundial, do fim da Segunda Guerra Mundial, vai ser justamente a criação da ONU, a criação dessas instituições, e a gente vai ter a questão justamente da partilha da Palestina. A Palestina era um mandato britânico, você tinha lá duas populações nativas que tinham um histórico já naquela região, tanto os judeus quanto os árabes, e aí, numa tentativa de solucionar aquele problema, a Inglaterra passa aquilo para a ONU aprova em 47 uma resolução para a partilha da Palestina. Quando termina o mandato britânico, os judeus eles aceitam aquela partilha, Israel declara sua independência em 14 de maio de 48, no dia seguinte todos os países árabes decidem invadir Israel porque não aceitam a existência de um Estado judeu no Oriente Médio. E aí a gente vai ter a crise dos refugiados palestinos, cerca de 600 a 800 mil palestinos eles vão sair de suas casas, só que vai ser criada uma nova definição de refugiados para os palestinos, que é diferente da definição que a gente tem dos refugiados atuais. Por quê? De acordo com a nossa definição de refugiado, os refugiados eles ficam debaixo do mandato do Acnur. E esse Acnur ele foi criado inicialmente para lidar somente com aqueles refugiados da Segunda Guerra, naquele contexto da Europa, mas o mandato dele foi sendo renovado e ele passou a ter uma atuação fora da Europa, à medida que os países, os países principalmente na África, na Ásia, foram se tornando independentes. Só que no caso da Palestina foi criada uma outra organização, que é a UNRWA. Então, hoje, os refugiados palestinos eles não ficam debaixo do mandato do Acnur. Por quê? Porque havia aquela ideia, foi criada a ideia nos árabes de que eles não iriam aceitar de maneira nenhuma a existência do Estado de Israel. Então, eles iriam se organizar, formar um grande exército para depois destruir Israel, o que eles tentaram fazer em 67 com a Guerra dos 6 Dias. Só que desde então a gente tem esses refugiados palestinos, eles vivendo nos países do Oriente Médio, na Jordânia, no Iraque, na Síria, no Líbano e no Egito. E com exceção da Jordânia, nesses outros países eles vivem como apátridas. Eles não têm cidadania. Eu tive a oportunidade de visitar um campo de refugiados palestinos no Líbano, um desses que foram criados ainda em 48. E diferente de outros refugiados, eles permanecem considerados palestinos, eles não têm cidadania libanesa. Então, por exemplo, se um sírio ou se um venezuelano ele vem para o Brasil e ele vive aqui como refugiado, ele tem um filho, o filho dele não vai ser mais refugiado, o filho dele já vai ser um cidadão brasileiro. Mas com os palestinos isso não acontece. Então, os palestinos, quando eles nascem em outros países, principalmente no Líbano, ali na região do Oriente Médio, eles não têm a cidadania daquele país, né, com exceção da Jordânia. Então eles ficam como apátridas. No caso do Líbano, eles não podem sequer assumir algumas profissões, como ser médico, advogado, engenheiro, e eles vivem realmente ali afastados da sociedade. E qual é então a solução para a causa dos palestinos? Qualquer refugiado, né, que fique debaixo do mandato do Acnur, você tem 3 soluções. Ou ele volta para o seu país de origem, ou ele é reassentado em um terceiro país, ou ele simplesmente é integrado naquele segundo país para onde ele foi. Só que há vários casos, né, principalmente no contexto de criação do Acnur, em que houve uma dissolução dos países onde aqueles refugiados saíram. Né, a gente teve, na mesma época que houve a partilha da Palestina, a gente teve também o processo de separação da Índia, do Paquistão, a gente teve os conflitos ali no leste europeu. Então, quando houve essa divisão do país, esse país ele deixou de existir, essa opção de você voltar ao seu país originário, ela simplesmente acabou. Ou você iria voltar para um país que se tornou independente, ou então as outras soluções ficavam disponíveis. No caso dos palestinos, eles rejeitam as 2 últimas opções. Eles insistem que a única solução viável é o retorno, só que o Estado da Palestina ele não foi concretizado, ele não foi criado. O que a gente tem hoje é o Estado de Israel e áreas que são disputadas, né, tanto na Cisjordânia como na faixa de Gaza. E isso acaba criando, primeiro, um entrave para a resolução desse conflito, porque eles afirmam que se Israel não aceitar o retorno desses palestinos, não vai haver paz. Só que se Israel aceitar esses palestinos, o Estado judeu ele vai desaparecer. Como é que o Estado judeu vai receber uma população diferente, um número tão grande? Então essa não é uma solução viável, né? Esses palestinos eles deveriam ter o direito de retorno para um futuro Estado palestino, assim como hoje os judeus eles podem ir para Israel. Na época em que os cerca de 600 mil palestinos se tornaram deslocados forçados, houve uma expulsão em massa dos judeus que viviam nos países árabes e de maioria islâmica. Cerca de 800 mil judeus foram expulsos, por exemplo, do Iêmen, do Iraque, do Egito, da Síria. Na Síria, inclusive, muitos judeus eles foram expulsos de suas casas para que palestinos pudessem viver nas casas desses judeus. Então, o que deveria ter acontecido era uma troca populacional, como aconteceu com a Índia e com o Paquistão, como aconteceu com outros países na época, mas isso não aconteceu e criou-se esse problema hoje no Oriente Médio, dos refugiados palestinos, e isso tem impacto também nas crises de refugiados globais, porque os países árabes, devido a essa noção que eles têm de refugiado palestino, eles não integram o regime internacional de refugiados que os demais países integram. Então, eles temem que se eles adotarem a declaração, a definição de 51 e o protocolo adicional, os palestinos eles vão deixar de ser refugiados e eles vão ter, então, essa responsabilidade com essas populações que estão no seu território. E aí você tem já uma população palestina que cresceu de 600 mil refugiados para hoje eles são quase 6 milhões, mais de 5 milhões, vivendo nesses países do Oriente Médio. E aí depois você começa a ter crises sucessivas, como a questão do Iraque, depois da invasão do Iraque em 2003 pelos Estados Unidos. Em 2011 começa a Primavera Árabe, então você vai ter 6 milhões de refugiados sírios, a maioria deles vão para esses países que já tinham uma população muito grande de refugiados palestinos, e essas populações elas ficam totalmente desassistidas. Então, só para vocês terem noção, 1 a cada 6 pessoas no Líbano, quer dizer, 1 a cada 8 pessoas no Líbano são refugiadas. Na Jordânia, 1 a cada 14. Então, esses estados árabes, eles não têm condições de lidar com esses refugiados que estão vindo, esses refugiados sírios, esses refugiados iraquianos. E aí o Acnur ele tem a dificuldade de lidar com essa situação, porque ele precisa ficar fazendo memorandos de compreensão específicos com cada um desses países. Só que, então, as soluções que são colocadas? A criação de campos de refugiados. E isso, na verdade, não é uma solução, porque você vai criando campos onde as pessoas ficam morando lá, e passa de 5 anos, eles são chamados de protracted refugees. Então, qual é a solução? Eles estão vivendo em cidades, se desenvolvendo. Você tem a questão das minorias religiosas, né? Muitos desses conflitos são causados por questões identitárias. Então, você tem um problema dos cristãos e dos yazidis, que foram perseguidos pelo Estado Islâmico. Eles não se sentem confortáveis de ir para campos de refugiados que tenham muçulmanos. Então, eles ficam a mercê aí da ajuda internacional, quando tem, de ONGs e coisas do tipo. E eles não são, então, abarcados por esse regime internacional. E aí chega um momento, obviamente, em que esses países eles não têm condições de lidar com esses refugiados, eles acabam aí migrando para o Ocidente, como eu falei, recorrem a meios que não são legais, e a gente tem crises como a gente viu na Europa em 2015, a gente vê pessoas se lançando ao mar, em botes, querendo atravessar, chegar na Europa, e uma consequência é o quê? É o recrudescimento aí do discurso de ódio, a gente começa a ver o surgimento de grupos supremacistas brancos, de grupos nacionalistas, então a gente vai vendo como que no contexto internacional que a gente vive hoje, nenhum país é uma ilha, né? O que acontece em um país acaba influenciando o outro. E os conflitos no Oriente Médio, eles começam lá, mas eles não terminam lá. E a gente começa a sentir o impacto disso na geopolítica, principalmente da região, mas depois tem impacto no mundo inteiro. Né? Essa onda que a gente viu aí de fortalecimentos, né, da direita e de grupos como esse, a gente viu que foi algo que também afetou o Brasil. Tem um número pequeno de refugiados, né, são cerca de 2 mil refugiados sírios que vieram para o Brasil. O Brasil deu visto humanitário para os sírios, vieram 2 mil só. Desses 2 mil, se tem 1.000 no país ainda é muito, mas a gente vê um discurso muitas vezes xenofóbico, islamofóbico contra essas populações. Isso acaba refletindo aí em discurso de ódio na internet e coisa do tipo. Então, o grande desafio hoje da gente falar sobre refugiados e falar sobre deslocamentos forçados e migrações, direitos humanos aqui no sul global é justamente o fato de que nem todos os países eles fazem parte, né, do regime internacional de refugiados, né, o direito internacional ele não é adotado por todos os países, e até mesmo aqueles que adotam, né, como é o caso dos Estados Unidos, nem sempre cumprem. Então, o fato de haver uma legislação internacional, de haver países aceitando, adotando essas leis, também significa que eles vão cumprir. E sem falar que essa própria lei internacional que a gente tem, ela está muito desatualizada. Então, um dos grandes dilemas que a gente tem hoje, nos dias atuais, é a questão, né, do pertencimento ao grupo social, né, das mulheres, da população LGBT. Então, a gente teve casos, por exemplo, do Estado Islâmico, de homossexuais que eram perseguidos pelo Estado Islâmico e eles não conseguiam se enquadrar nessa definição, não tinha políticas de refúgio específico para eles, e eles chegavam nos campos de refugiados na Síria, nos países vizinhos, sofriam abuso sexual, não só mulheres, mas homens também acabam sendo vítimas disso. A gente tem agora a Uganda, né, que aprovou uma lei que torna a homossexualidade passível por crime, por pena de morte. Então, provavelmente a gente vai ter pessoas que vão fugir da Uganda por causa disso. Né? O Brasil agora está querendo criar uma diretriz específica para receber população, refugiados que são LGBTQIA+, mas a gente sabe que nem mesmo no Brasil essa população ela é totalmente protegida, né? Então, esse é um grande dilema. A própria questão das minorias religiosas também é algo que precisa ser considerado. E a gente tem também os chamados refugiados ambientais, os blocados ambientais. Hoje a gente vive aí vários dilemas em relação ao meio ambiente, países que estão desaparecendo por conta do aumento do nível do mar, e para onde é que essas pessoas vão? Então a gente precisa aí reabrir, né, a agenda de discussões sobre direito internacional, sobre migrações. Como a professora falou, o direito internacional é uma área fascinante, às vezes ela é bem deprimente, porque a gente vai vendo esse horror de lei que ela não é colocada em prática, mas por outro lado a gente vê que também há muitas lacunas que precisam ser abordadas, e isso tem um impacto direto na nossa vida. Né? O Brasil ele hoje tem lidado com essa crise também dos refugiados venezuelanos. A gente recebeu um número muito pequeno se a gente compara com outros países da região, né? A gente tem a Colômbia, que recebeu mais de 1 milhão, a gente recebeu 70 mil, e eu fico impressionado como que isso afetou o país como um todo. Né? A gente viu que, inicialmente, os estados que eram mais afetados, aqueles que ficavam ali no norte, perto da fronteira, mas hoje a gente tem refugiados venezuelanos, né, pedindo nas ruas do Brasil praticamente todas as cidades. Eu não sei aqui em Uberlândia, mas eu estou morando agora em Belo Horizonte, já vi muitos lá, mas também em Campina Grande, a minha cidade natal, lá no interior da Paraíba, muito mais, a gente está mais perto da África do que do resto das Américas, né? João Pessoa é o ponto mais oriental das Américas. A gente está mais perto da África do que da Venezuela. E lá a prefeitura estava tendo que lidar com esse problema de refugiados vindo nas ruas. Então, novamente, isso não é algo que é abstrato, isso não é algo que está lá do outro lado do mundo. Mesmo que está lá do outro lado do mundo, acaba respingando na gente. E esse é um dos desafios que vocês vão ter enquanto futuros internacionalistas, independentemente da área que vocês vão seguir, se vão ser na academia, na diplomacia, na iniciativa privada, no terceiro setor. são questões que a gente não pode ignorar. Isso faz falta aí da temática cada vez mais internacional, nos fóruns multilaterais. Né? A gente tem um exemplo claro aqui mesmo aqui no Brasil, na semana passada, né, a cúpula que houve dos países da América Latina, em todas as suas controvérsias, mas um dos pontos principais é justamente esse, é lidar com essa questão dos refugiados venezuelanos. Como é que você vai lidar com isso? Você tem que dialogar com a Venezuela, que é o país que produz esses refugiados, mas os países que acolhem também têm que estar presentes, têm que falar. Então, são desafios que, infelizmente, eles não vão desaparecer. Eles estão crescendo cada vez mais, porque cada ano, infelizmente, a gente tem novos conflitos, fora as questões ambientais, fora essas questões de gênero, as questões religiosas, que, infelizmente, tendem a se intensificar aí nos últimos anos. É isso.
Muito obrigado, professor Igor, pela sua contribuição. Eu gostaria agora de passar a palavra à professora Tatiana Skeff, que vai tecer os seus comentários.
Bom, boa noite a todas e todos. É um prazer imenso poder tecer alguns comentários acerca das falas que aqui foram proferidas pelo professor Igor, pela professora Cristina. Para que a professora Cristina possa acompanhar, eu também vou fazer alguns comentários em inglês, na medida em que a ideia aqui do debate é que eles possam também reagir a esses comentários. So I was saying that I'm going to make some comments in English so you can follow up and then we can have a debate. Something that really struck me about the presentation of Professor Cristina was that there are many violations of human rights that we can see from what the U.S. or the U.S. policy has been doing and has been applied, so on and so forth, since, let's say, at least not only Biden or Obama or Trump, but even before, when we had President Bush also, especially after September 11. So it is shocking to me when we come to realize how many violations, and not only violations of human rights, but how we cannot respond to those violations through international law. Something that is really important that in Brazil, at least, we have is that Brazil is part of the Inter-American System of Human Rights. And we do have, we are party of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is very much important when, for instance, the U.S. is not, for seeing these kind of cases. And I highlight here two advisory opinions that are very important on that matter. First, the advisory opinion number 18 of 2003 on undocumented migrants that was asked by Mexico, specifically talking about how the migrants were treated. Mexican migrants are treated in the U.S. and how being undocumented does not prevent them from getting, for example, N status. But it is interesting because that advisory opinion is from 2003. And then we come to realize that it's just after September 11 and how after September 11 things got a little bit harsh for migrants in the U.S. Not as harsh, I would say, considering Donald Trump, because during the Trump mandate or presidency, we had a lot of violations, right? But then we come to think, okay, even undocumented migrants have rights under the Inter-American System, and Mexico asked for it specifically for the situation of Mexicans in the United States, and we did not have any response. Of course, the U.S. is not bound to it, but even if it's not bound to it, at least some answers we would hopefully get. But then we come to think that the United States system doesn't put international law in first, actually puts international law even below federal law sometimes, and this makes the case very difficult. A second advisory opinion that I would recall was asked by the Mercosur members in 2014. It was advisory opinion number 21. That advisory opinion relates to migrant children and how migrant children should be treated
And it specifically deals with migration, the criminalization of migration of children, saying that we should not actually have any sort of imprisonment for children, which is actually what I would say the Reno versus Flores in your presentation was actually dialoguing to the Inter-American Court sometimes, but I don't recall having any mention of that. But still, back in 2014, we were having many cases still in the US talking about the situation of migrant children from Central America that were brought to the US, undocumented children, unaccompanied children that did not have any sort of treatment or human rights issues were very clear on that situation. So it is interesting because, at least here in Brazil, if we follow those advisory opinions, we would have not to act like the United States did, right? And this is something interesting because during our Bolsonaro mandate, we, in 2019, for instance, before even the pandemic, they were trying to pass some legislation that would create the figure of the criminal migrant, or the strange migrant, and the figure that the person is against, for instance, our national security again. Something that our Brazilian legislation does not prescribe, even after 2017 when we passed the new migration law. So it is very much interesting because we were kind of copying what Donald Trump was doing in the US and trying to reapply it to to Brazil from the United States. So it is interesting in that point of view that how much the American policy affects the countries in the region and how they react to migration law and how they actually, it depends of course on the government, but how they react on that. And then we had, for instance, Professor Igor talking about refugee camps and how refugee camps are not the solution, but actually they create even a worse situation of a place where the law is not even there, is not even applicable, and where we have a lot of violations of human rights. We do not have any right to sanitation, education, or even integrity if we come to think about other violations that a person can suffer within a refugee camp. So it is interesting because actually those family detention centers that you were showing, they resemble refugee camps. And the interesting part is that they resemble also the shelters that we have in the north part of Brazil, where we were actually receiving Venezuelans, because they look like the same, and they have periods of times where it is open and people can come in and come out, but others that people cannot come out. They regulate the life of migrants who are in these shelters, which resemble refugee camps, but still, it is kind of a mirror of what the US is doing and, okay, what Latin America or Brazil is doing. So it is quite interesting. And then I come to think, when it comes for similar situations, the situation in Mexico now that you said, Mexico is doing the dirty work for the US now, because Mexico is actually controlling the borders for the US and actually sending people back home before they even try applying for an asylum status within the US. And that resembles the case of Turkey that Professor Igor was talking about, because it is the same thing. That Turkey, because of the agreements they signed with the European Union, now they do this very exact same thing, as to create this possibility of allowing or not allowing people to go through Turkey to Europe in order to ask for an asylum status. So it is quite interesting that we see not only in the US, but also not only to Latin America, this mirroring, but also to the Middle East or even to Europe, and how countries in the global north are actually reacting towards this influx of migrants from the global south. Professor Igor even said that we have 69% of the displaced people around the world coming from the global south, He quoted Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. So it is quite interesting that we have all these people from the global south, and then they try to reach sometimes countries in the global north, although it's not that typical, because he also mentioned that we have normally people staying in the neighboring countries and not going so far, but the reaction of the global north is actually the same. Is discriminatory, is the creation of the image of the enemy or the other or somebody that is unwanted. Even though we have many international agreements that say that we cannot act like that. It's not only refugee law, it's not only asylum law, it's human rights law that says that we cannot discriminate. Even that is prescribed under the UN Charter. So it is something that I would say, this is not a problem of law itself, because law we have. This is a problem of policy maybe, or the application of policy by governments. But then my question would be, how can we act towards these governments for them to follow simple agreements that they have signed and they agree? Of course, there are some parts of the globe are not part of, like the US to the inter-American system. Nevertheless, how can we react towards that? That's something that was in the back of my mind when both of you were talking. So this is my reaction to your talks. I would like to maybe get some reply on that. But I would like to thank you both for this presentation. It's a great opening panel. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. That's so thoughtful. Yeah. I mean, first I always feel reflexively like a need to apologize for what we do in the U.S. But at the same time, when you tell me how everything, we mirror one another, right? We are a world community, whether we think about that or not. The U.S. we certainly don't think of ourselves as, I think part of the world community. And when I was thinking about human rights violations, like you said, Tatiana, it's not just asylum law. I mean, we have the death penalty in the United States, and Mexico asks all the time for us not to execute their citizens, and we do it constantly, right? I mean, we put citizens of other nations to death in our country, despite pleas, despite cries against it. I mean, and we never respect those requests, and I just think of the outrage that we would have in the U.S. if someone put our citizens to death. So, again, the hypocrisy and the kind of, just kind of narcissism of the U.S. culture reminds me of that. But what you were saying about, like, how do we get people to follow our own agreements? I think, again, in the U.S., when Jeff Sessions was Attorney General, Jeff under Trump, the Attorney General is actually the person who's in charge of enforcing the immigration laws for the president, the policies, right? Because, like I said, it's not just law, it's policy, right? Which is like, presidents have different policies. But when everybody knows how Jeff Sessions and Trump tried to revoke DACA, right? The for the deferred action for childhood arrivals for the children who come to the U.S. as young kids. But the other thing that the Trump administration tried to do was to eliminate domestic violence and gang violence as grounds for asylum. And when you read the decision that he and his subsequent Attorney General Bill Barr said, they basically were saying that our refugee laws, both domestic and international, don't recognize private violence. It was, the type of the Refugee Convention and the protocols were all in response to World War II. This idea that you can only be persecuted and have a well-founded fear of persecution that's deserving of protection if the government is persecuting you. So this idea that, like, you cannot be a refugee unless your persecutor is the government. And I think what we have to do is we have to reframe the way we think of who is a refugee, right? Who is a refugee and who deserves protection? I think that's the only way we're going to be able to get at least the U.S. to do what we said we would do. We have to say who is a refugee, and I think, again, very resistant still in the federal courts. So our levels are, the administrative level, then we have the federal court level. Depending on your federal court, your circuit court, some federal courts are more receptive to the argument that just being a woman is grounds of persecution. We've had a lot of success recently, kind of shockingly, when we say, look, Guatemalan women are a particular social group. I mean, that's been winning recently, right? I mean, it's been shocking, but there's been a long movement to get that recognized in our courts. So again, who is a refugee? Who deserves protection? I think that's the only way we're going to change it. That's just my thoughts.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that the U.S. has a very important role to play on this challenge that we have by redefining who is a refugee and who is not. And I think that the fact that the U.S. is not abiding by their own laws, this gives credibility for other countries to say, oh, since the U.S. is not following, since the countries in the north, they are not following the laws that they themselves have created, so why would we follow their laws? Why would we follow their rules? So when I look at the number of refugees that are resettled in the U.S. and in Europe, yes, the U.S. is still the country that most resettles refugees yet, but when we compare the burden that these neighboring countries, the countries in the south, they have, it's a very unfair share. So I think that, first of all, the countries in the north, they need to share this burden in a more fair and equal way. And by doing that, we're going to be able to start having these new conversations about who's a refugee, who should be considered a refugee or not. And I think that in the case of the U.S. very specifically because the U.S. has some important bodies in the government concerning the protection and promotion of some specific human rights around the world. So for example, the U.S. has an ambassador for religious freedom, has an ambassador in the combat against anti-Semitism, has an ambassador for the human rights of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think that these institutions are like really important. The U.S. is bringing to the international community important issues to be discussed. But concerning anti-Semitism, for example, at the same time that we had Dr. Deborah Lipschart fighting anti-Semitism around the world and talking to Saudi Arabia and talking to the Arab countries, we had a rise in anti-Semitic cases in the U.S. So what did the Biden administration do? At least they created a national strategy to fight anti-Semitism and lead by the example. So I think that this should be done concerning refugees, concerning these other issues that are really important. But I also think that we as civil society, as academics, scholars, researchers, we also have a role to play by bringing attention about these issues, especially since we are living in democracies. So we need to start bringing these issues to be debated in the political arena. I remember, for example, when we had the U.S. soldiers leaving Afghanistan, and many Afghans, they were trying to get refuge around the world, and all the countries were closing the doors, and some NGOs were willing to bring some of these refugees to Brazil just for a season, because they had to leave Kabul before the airport was closed, and some of them were going to the U.S., but during the season they would be vetted by the U.S. government, screened by the U.S. government. This NGO would pay for them to stay here in Brazil. And the Brazilian government didn't answer in time. So there was a mobilization in the media, the journalists, people raising attention, raising warnings about that, civil society leaders writing letters to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, questioning why is not Brazil receiving these refugees. And so there was a pressure from the civil society. And afterwards, Brazil received some Afghan refugees. Actually, some of them are starting to arrive in the country. Right now, there are still a lot of challenges. Some of them were living in their airport in Guarulhos in São Paulo because they didn't have protection from the government here. Because that's what the Brazilian government does. They say, if you want to flee and come to Brazil, you can come. But when they get here, they are by themselves and by the will of NGOs and civil society. So that's why it's hard for us to talk about refugees here, because we don't have a program like in the US in which civil society plays a very important role by receiving them, resettling them, teaching the language. We are starting to have that, but we don't have laws regulating how can civilians receive these refugees and take care of them. So I think that is the things that we can do. it's hard for us to change the US and ask them, pressure them to be the model. But I think that we can make like this effort within our own countries here in the South and try to make this change here.
Eu gostaria então de agradecer aos comentários e às provocações da professora Tatiana, as respostas da professora Cristina e também do professor Igor. E agora a gente abre ao público para perguntas. Então, acho que as monitoras conseguem me ajudar aqui. Se existe alguma pergunta para a gente...
Pode levantar, pessoal.
Não, eu vou aceitar pegar o microfone para dar.
Existe uma pergunta, gente, do público. Just for you to get here, we're asking for the public if they have any questions for you, Professor Igor, okay? Okay, João has a question.
Pode falar.
Eu vou tentar em inglês, porque acaba ficando para os dois. Mas, well, thank you very much. Firstly, wonderful exposition from both. But I have a question, mostly concerning the. I mean, we've seen so far blatant violations of human rights, both from how the U.S. has been treating migrants and refugees, and also how the European Union and Turkey have been dealing with these crises. And I'm an international relations student, and I've dedicated my studies to international law in general. And we have our own views when it comes to studying. We see decisions, we see documents, we see reports, we see news. And I think it's a very different view from what we have when you see someone who's looking at it from what would be the front lines. So what a lawyer dealing directly with the refugees, what a researcher dealing directly with those camps sees. So my question would be more on first for Professor Kempo, why would you think that the U.S. is so comfortable with putting itself in such a position? Because in international relations we have our own side of things, our own political side of things, but what would someone in the front lines, in the law side of things, how do you see the U.S. being so comfortable, being in such a position of blatant violations as you presented? And then for Professor Sabino, why would you see that these states are so comfortable creating these situations of, is it better to just postigate the violations rather than deal with them as of now? So that would be, thank you very much again.
So I guess I would say, well, first of all, I'm sorry, I do love my country, but we're a very ignorant populace, and I would say that most people in the U.S. don't actually know that we're violating international human rights, if they even know what international human rights are. Secondly, the people that do know, like the judges and the lawyers, they are, there's, I guess, the idea of American exceptionalism, that we are above everything, right? Like you said, I think you were saying, Tatiana, that like sometimes we put federal law above international law. I'm like, we always put federal law above international law. We don't care about international law. Like, I think when we talk about international law, everybody's like, oh, that's kind of like a suggestion, like a guide. I think that's really what the American legal system looks at international law as, like a guide, like a maybe, like a suggestion, like, oh, that's a good idea. Like you said, these advisory opinions, even if we were part of the international tribunals, I'm quite sure we wouldn't follow them, because, again, back to the whole idea of American exceptionalism is like this very individualistic kind of like rebel cowboy, like the myth of America. I think that has permeated our culture in a very toxic way, including in the law, right? And so I think that's why we're comfortable with it. It's our culture. Again, it's disturbing and distressing, and again, I think too that we believe, we being our populace, that coming to the U.S. is a privilege. Everybody, wants it, which of course is not true. But don't tell that to people in America, because like we're the best. And this idea that that not everybody. I don't know. I guess we just don't have the type of, I think, empathy that we should for humans in general, including our own people. Right now we hate each other, so So that would be, I guess, why we're so comfortable with it.
Well, I'd say that's because the costs of violating these human rights, they are low. You know, these countries, they feel free to keep doing what they're doing, not only the US, but Brazil as well, Turkey, the European Union, because there are no bigger costs for them. There will be some pressure for international organizations, human rights activists that are going to be abroad, but there will not be something substantial for them. There is not a heavy price they will pay for those violations. Quite the opposite. Sometimes when they calculate the cost, it would be better to be criticized by some activists than receiving a large number of refugees, because that's something that somebody will say on social media or during a press conference or during an international meeting, like at the UN General Assembly, something like that. But after all, there will be no sanctions. There will be no hard. How can I say? They will not be punished by that. And I think that's a problem that we have in international relations as well, especially when it comes to international law. And that's why when we look to international regimes, we see that the most efficient regime is the economic regime because money is involved. But the same thing happens when you talk about the environmental laws and a lot of other issues. So I think that countries just obey international law when it suits their own interests. And it's not only the US. The US does that, yes, but I think that all countries do the same thing. And so in that regard, I think they are all the same. Although some countries, at least, they pretend to care more about human rights and when it suits them. That's it.
Alguma outra pergunta? Pode falar.
Vou falar daqui, pode ser? Me escuta? Oh, sorry. Can you understand me?
Yeah.
Because you just... I'm Ines from University of Brasilia. I'm also speaking in English because it'll be easier for the table. Congratulations for your presentations. Both were wonderful and I enjoy very much. And two things that show me in both presentations. International migration, I would say in a positive way, it's good because people move everywhere. But migration became a global problem because the states have failed. And the international law is supposed on 20th century to give an answer. What we can say is that even though we have the Inter-American human rights, even though United States is part, Brazil is part, so on, I think the only answer that we have very specific was from Dominican Republic, that the country were condemned. The country was condemned twice, I think, from the 3 times from what happened to Haitians on the other side, but the country just left. So I had a student on a master course, and she works at the ACNUR, and she found out that in 2015 it was on the 4th generation on the commented Haitians background. So we have families that lives apart from the social state, so they don't have any rights. So my question to both, and this is going to see everywhere, what you show on the presentation is that we have to do something on national level, because international level, as Professor Tatiana pointed out, we have just soft law. So we have an opinion, we have some things. And on countries that are not democratic, I think we're not going to have an answer at all. So democracy is necessary to, at least to show to people that we need to do something. Like you said, people in the United States do not know that they have some human rights violations inside their countries. And even in Brazil, if you ask, is there any human rights violation, probably most of them, apart from law school, they may say that everything's fine because, for instance, basic human rights are violated. People are starving. It's not hunger only, but they are starving, not only in Brazil, but everywhere. So this is the basic right to have access to food. And in both opinions, what should be the best answer? Both together, national and international, starting local and after national and global. How can you face migration as a global problem, considering, although we have movement of people, they are closer. We have this north-south movement because, as some scholars has pointed out, migrants go to rich country because they can find something. Brazil is not a poor country, otherwise they don't come. Nobody comes here. So we have something to offer. We are middle class country, so we have something to offer. But I like very much Bauman when he said, migration is a conscious decision. You go where the richness exists, or you have a perspective to do something. What happened in Central America? The states failed. So there is a chance, at least in the United States, but at least a chance. Because states fail, you have no hope there. So how can, because some people are going to decide, others, like you said, is going to be forced. Forced not only because they want to move, but because they want to change life. When in their own country there is no hope. So what law can do for that? Thank you so much.
I mean, I think, I think about this a lot, obviously. I mean, to me, it's at least in the U.S., we have, like I said, already said, a lack of empathy. I think because we're such a privileged country, it's very hard for people to put themselves in the position of being a migrant, right? I think, even the horrible pictures we see of, like, the babies who die crossing the river, right? It's very much evocative of the child in the refugee child in Syria, right, who died, right? We have those pictures all the time, and people are like, well, they chose to do that. And it's like, it's not, right? That's not a choice when you're fleeing for your life. And I say to people, I'm like, wouldn't you do anything to save your child's life? Wouldn't you? Of course I would. Would you, like, cross a border if, like, you needed to, like, save your child's life? They're like, oh, no, I wouldn't do that. I'm like, you're a liar. You are an effing liar, right? But because we are Americans, we're from the United States, people don't understand, too, like, why. I mean, I've had students of mine, my law students, say, like, why did she come here from El Salvador? Like, why didn't she just get on a plane and come to the U.S.? I'm like Americans, we are blinded by our own privilege. I'm like, yeah, no, you have an American passport, so you can get on a plane and go wherever you want, but other people can't do that. And these are law students, these are educated people, these are not stupid people. We are just blinded by our own privilege. And so I think for the Americans, we need to have more empathy. We need to understand that nobody's insulated from this. Like, migration is the oldest story, right? The oldest story. I think that this year, at least in the U.S., there was a really good job around Christmas time of being like, a young woman fled on the back of a donkey, and everybody's like, oh, it's so sad. They're like, oh my God, it's Jesus, the Jesus story of Jesus Christ, because we're a very Christian country, and so that whole stuff. Yeah, it's the oldest story in the world, right? Fleeing persecution, and it's a human right. So but I think that's the limits of the law, right? Your question was like, how can the law respond to it? I always tell my students, like, I can teach you the law, but I can't make you care, right? I think people need to care. I think again, back in America, we have a very kind of like, me. And like you said, it's not just America, right? It's human nature. But like I said, I think it's the limits of the law, and I think we need to tell people stories and engender some empathy and understand that it could be you too. I think that's for me the kind of the key.
Yeah, I definitely, I agree with you 100%. And I think that definitely the liberal world order has failed. So all the consensus that was built after the Second World War about human rights and international institutions, the basis of all the regimes that we have, the human rights, the refugee regimes, I think that all those laws, if they were to be created today, they wouldn't. Because we are moving to a post-liberal order, and we have some people saying that, no, we don't want to be liberal anymore, we don't think that democracy is the best way to organize ourselves socially. So I think that the first thing that we need to do is to express the importance and the need of democracy, of democratic regime, and use this democracy that we have to mobilize people, sensibilize them, raise awareness about the challenges of the world, and show how we cannot solve them if we focus just on ourselves. We cannot just turn a blind eye and the problem won't just go away. And I stress the need for us to strengthen democracy, because I've been to some of these countries where we have problems with refugees, and especially in the Middle East. I've been to Egypt, to Jordan, to Lebanon, close to Syria several times, and very close I couldn't get into. And one of the things that I see is that the refugees are being mistreated there, they don't have rights, but even the population, the people who care about them, the people who are compassionate about them, who are trying to help them, they don't have a voice. They don't have how to protest and say to their governments like, hey, please do more, you need to do more, you need to treat well these people, because the state doesn't even treat well their own citizens. So these citizens who are like trying to help the refugees, they don't even have their human rights, their basic civil rights respected. So I think that we who are living, although we are in the south of the world here in Brazil, but we are who are living in democratic countries, we have more responsibility than other countries who are not democracies. And I think that's our duty, it's our role to educate people about what's going on around the world and start to bring these informations to the political debate. I think that in the US, at least, you talk a little bit more about foreign policy, because of course the US is like a big power, but here in Brazil we don't talk about international politics when it comes to domestic issues. I'm more focused with things here. So I think that many people don't have an idea about what's going on around the world, and that's why they don't care, because they definitely just don't know what's going on. So
well, that's true of the U.S. too.
Yeah.
Most people don't know, I think, but because they're watching news that's not news, it's entertainment.
Yeah.
But what you said is so true about, and I think about when I teach immigration, a lot of my students, I talk about how it's really about membership and belonging. And what you said about, like, remember when the Paris shooting happened in 2015, right? The people who did that were people, they were French, but they were refugees, like many generations of refugees living in France, and they had no way to regularize their status, right? You see that in the U.S. too. We have generations of, for example, people from El Salvador who have had temporary protected status for 40 years, right? They have no way to remain, no right to stay, no way to vote, no way to become a citizen, except for their kids maybe, but not integrating people, not allowing people full membership in society engenders this instability, right? So like, I think the messaging has to be, it's good for us, meaning us collectively as a society, to accept refugees and migrants. They make our society better. I mean, immigrants' rights in the U.S., that's one of our big messages, not just that we are all were immigrants except for the First Nations, the indigenous people who came, and we tried to kill them all, but there's some of them still remain. But we're a nation of immigrants, and the immigrants make us stronger. It's to all of our benefit to not just receive them, but to support them and give them resources. But I think maybe that's part of the answer, to not have it fail. I don't know. I clearly don't have the answers, but yeah, I thought your point of that was really, really good.
And just to finish, there was during Trump-Bolsonaro era, they sent the Brazilian child and teenagers by airplane to Brazil. And
Trump did?
Yes, they.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. And I, our government didn't say anything about that. Just say, oh, they were wrong, so...
Yeah. Actually, Brazil facilitated that. Instead of fighting for their own national, Brazil was against their own nationals to side with the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I pointed out to an immigration judge once in court. I had a client from El Salvador who was going to be removed, and she was the guardian of her U.S. citizen grandson. And the government attorney actually said on the record, because I was like, because we had to show harm to a citizen or permanent resident relative, and I said, if she gets deported, he's not going to have anybody to raise him, he's going to become a ward of the state. And the government attorney actually said on the record, well, he's little, he won't know the difference, he could just be like, yeah, his own citizen, right? And I said, you know what, I was like, this is not, we don't live in a country where like just because somebody is 3 years old and brown, his rights are not as important as any other U.S. citizen. And the judge was like, no. I was like, seriously, that's what she just said. So we do it too, and it's bad, but I apologize for Trump and his influence on the world. He also was, the guy who said at one point, they asked him at one point, where do you want immigrants to come from? And he was like, Norway. And I was like, Norway? I mean, he has that famous, quote about, excuse the language, shithole countries, right? And that horrible... That's clearly his view, but that's frankly the view of a lot of people in the U.S., which is unfortunate. So again, lack of empathy.
Então, pessoal, eu acredito que, por questões logísticas, vamos encerrar agora. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. I have too, but we have other moments to share the questions with the professors, and I'm sure they will be available to talk to you. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todo mundo, gostaria de agradecer novamente ao professor Igor, à professora Cristina Campbell, por estar aqui com a gente hoje, nesse primeiro painel do nosso evento, a presença de todos vocês que foi muito legal, os comentários da professora Tatiana, e eu declaro agora encerrado o primeiro painel do 8º Simpósio sobre Migrações e Proteção de Pessoas da GESIR, da Universidade Federal de Berlândia. Thank you all, thank you Professor Cristina.